More than 1 million Americans live in Mexico. Most of them say the same thing. It is safer than the city they left. The reporting is exaggerated, and they have never had a problem. The people in this video said it too, several on camera. What happened to them has never been fully explained. Section 1. John Walker. John Clay Walker was born on October 5, 1948, in Washington, D.C. He enlisted in the United States Marine Corps and served in Vietnam, where he was wounded on 2 separate occasions and was awarded 2 Purple Hearts. After the war, he used the GI Bill to attend the University of Minnesota, earning a degree in journalism in 1976. He spent the years that followed working as a reporter and photographer at small newspapers across Minnesota and Iowa, covering local news and building a set of bylines. He married a woman named Eve. They had daughters, and by the early 1980s, the family was living in Minnesota with the kind of settled arrangement that a modest newspaper career supports. Walker also had a novel he had been trying to write for years and had never been able to finish while working full-time in a newsroom. In 1983, he decided to do something about that. He and Eve took the children out of school, packed up the house, and moved to Guadalajara, Mexico, for what was planned as a single sabbatical year in which he could write without a job pulling him away every morning. Guadalajara, in 1983, was a reasonable choice for that plan, and a great many Americans had reached the same conclusion before him. The city was the second largest in Mexico, with a population above 2 million. It sat at 5,000 feet in the Jalisco highlands, which gave it a mild climate through most of the year, without the altitude sickness that affected some visitors to Mexico City. The colonial center was intact. The cost of living was a fraction of what it was in the United States. There was an established foreign community that had been growing since the 1950s, including retirees on fixed incomes, students at the city's large American-run medical school, language students, artists, and people who had arrived intending to stay a season and had been there for 20 years. That community had its own social calendar, its own churches, and its own network of landlords who rented to foreigners. A family arriving from Minnesota would have found it straightforward to settle in. The legal side was straightforward as well, which is part of why the American population in Mexico grew the way it did. Mexico issued a resident document, commonly referred to at the time by the shorthand FM3, renewable annually, which allowed a foreigner to live in the country without working for a Mexican employer. Retirees qualified by showing a fixed income from abroad. Writers, students, and people living off savings qualified on similar terms. There was no requirement to give up American citizenship and no residency test to pass, and the fees were low. An American could hold that status for decades, as many did, crossing back for medical appointments or family visits and returning without difficulty. What none of them had much contact with was the other thing Guadalajara had become. The city was the operational headquarters of the largest drug trafficking organization in Mexico, and had been for most of a decade. That organization was run by 3 men. Rafael Caro Quintero, the youngest of the 3, handled the agricultural side, meaning the cultivation and harvest of marijuana on a scale that had no precedent in the country. Ernesto Fonseca Carrillo, known as Don Neto, was one of the founding figures and managed distribution. Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo, a former Sinaloa state police officer, held the whole structure together and maintained the political relationships that kept it functioning. Between them, they controlled the movement of marijuana and heroin north across the border in quantities that American law enforcement had not yet fully understood. The reason an operation of that size could run out of a major city rather than a remote mountain range was protection. Mexico at the time had a domestic intelligence agency called the Dirección Federal de Seguridad, usually shortened to the DFS, which had been created in the 1940s to monitor political threats to the government. By the 1970s and early 1980s, it had become something else. DFS agents carried federal credentials that let them move freely, arrest people, and pass through checkpoints, and a significant number of them were on the payroll of the traffickers they were nominally responsible for investigating. DFS credentials were reportedly issued to cartel figures directly. The organization running Guadalajara was not hiding from the Mexican state so much as operating with a portion of it. The product moving through that arrangement was mostly marijuana, and the economics of it in the early 1980s are worth setting out. Mexican marijuana at that point supplied a large share of the American market. It was grown in the mountains of Sinaloa, Durango, Chihuahua, and Guerrero, cured, compressed into bales, and moved north by truck and light aircraft to crossing points along the border. The margins were enormous because the raw agricultural cost was almost nothing, and the retail price in the United States reflected the risk of the crossing rather than the value of the plant. What that meant in practice was that the limiting factor on the business was never demand or supply. It was land, labor, and protection. And the organization in Guadalajara had assembled all three at a scale nobody outside it had measured. Walker's sabbatical year ended, and the family's plan changed. Eve took the daughters back to Minnesota. Walker did not go with them. The manuscript was not finished, and he was not willing to leave without it, so he stayed on alone in Guadalajara through 1984 and into the first weeks of 1985, living in the city and working through the last section of the book. Alberto Radelat arrived in December 1984 to visit him. Radelat was Cuban-American, in his early 30s, and was studying to be a dentist. He had come from Fort Worth, Texas. He and Walker were friends of the kind that survives distance, and Radelat had heard enough about Guadalajara over the years to want to see the place for himself. By the time Radelat arrived, the situation inside the organization running the city had changed sharply, for reasons that had nothing to do with either man. On November 10, 1984, Mexican soldiers acting on intelligence developed inside the DEA's Guadalajara office raided a marijuana plantation in the state of Chihuahua called Rancho Buffalo and destroyed it. Accounts of the size of that plantation vary. The figure repeated most often in press coverage is roughly 2,500 acres. The DEA's own historical account, as reported by Forbes in 2013, gives the area as approximately 540 hectares, which works out to about 1,344 acres. Both figures describe an industrial operation. What the accounts agree on is the outcome. Thousands of tons of marijuana were burned, several thousand farm workers were displaced, and the men who owned the crop lost a sum that has been estimated in the billions of dollars. They had paid for protection, specifically so that this would not happen. The protection had failed, and in the weeks that followed, the leadership of the Guadalajara cartel arrived at the conclusion that someone had informed. That conclusion produced a series of killings in the city over the following 10 weeks. The first involved 4 American missionaries. On December 2, 1984, 2 married couples who were Jehovah's Witnesses knocked on a door in Guadalajara while going house to house. They had moved to the city to do exactly that work. According to testimony given years later by Jorge Godoy, a former Jalisco State Judicial Police officer who had been assigned as a bodyguard to Fonseca Carrillo, the door they knocked on belonged to the cartel. All 4 were taken inside, held for a period of hours, and killed. Their bodies have never been recovered. No one has ever been charged. That account rests on witness testimony rather than on any prosecution, which is why the case is described here as background rather than as one of the 10, but it establishes what the organization running Guadalajara was doing with unfamiliar Americans by the end of 1984. On the evening of January 30th, 1985, Walker and Radelat went out to eat. They chose a seafood restaurant called La Langosta. There is no indication in any account that the choice was anything other than ordinary. A section of the restaurant had been closed that night for a private gathering of somewhere between 10 and 15 men connected to the cartel. Ernesto Fonseca Carrillo was among those associated with the party. The group had been drinking for some time before the 2 Americans walked in. The court record produced by the American criminal proceedings that followed describes what happened next. Walker and Radelat were seized by the group and beaten with fists and with weapons. They were dragged into a storage room at the back of the restaurant, where the beating continued and where both men were tortured with ice picks. The men holding them were trying to establish who they were and why they had come into the room. Neither man had any connection to the DEA. Neither had any involvement in drug enforcement or law enforcement of any kind. The court record states plainly that neither had any apparent association with the DEA or with any drug-related activity. At some point during the interrogation, one of the two said something that the people holding them took as an admission that they were police, which was not true and which was almost certainly said to make the beating stop. Walker died in the storage room from blunt force trauma to the head. Radelat, according to the accounts that emerged later, was still alive when both men were wrapped in tablecloths and carpet, loaded into a vehicle, and driven out of the city. They were buried at San Isidro Mazatepec, a park area in the municipality of Zapopan, on the edge of Guadalajara. Eve Walker received a call from the State Department telling her that her husband and his friend had disappeared and had last been seen entering a restaurant. There was no body, no accessible crime scene, and no functioning process to pursue. 2 adult American men had vanished from a public restaurant in the second-largest city in Mexico, in a building where a group of identifiable men had been drinking for hours, and the investigation went nowhere because the institutions that would have had to move it were compromised. Walker's daughters grew up inside that silence. Lanny Walker said years later that she and her sister had lost close to 40 years with their father. The bodies were unearthed shortly after midnight on June 18, 1985, nearly 5 months after the killings, on information provided by a witness named Francisco Tejeda. The cloth and carpet the 2 men had been wrapped in were riddled with bullet holes. Mexico's Deputy Attorney General at the time, Enrique Arenal Alonso, stated afterward that Caro Quintero and Fonseca Carrillo, questioned separately, had each acknowledged ordering the killings. On November 27th of that year, a man named Luis Gonzalez Ontiveros, known as Luisillo, was arrested as an accomplice. Eve Walker remarried and raised the daughters in the United States. The manuscript stayed in the family. Neither daughter has ever been given an account by any Mexican authority of who was in the restaurant that night, beyond the names that emerged through the American court proceedings, and no Mexican prosecution was ever brought against anyone for either killing. The prosecution that produced a conviction took place in the United States rather than Mexico. Javier Vázquez Velasco was tried in federal court in Los Angeles and convicted on August 6, 1990, under a federal statute covering violent crimes committed in aid of racketeering. On May 23, 1991, he was sentenced to 2 consecutive terms of life imprisonment, with the murders of Walker and Radelat forming the basis of the conviction. The legal reasoning behind that case is unusual and is the reason it is still cited. The killings took place entirely on Mexican soil, against 2 private American citizens with no official status of any kind. American prosecutors argued that federal racketeering law reached the conduct anyway, on the grounds that the 2 men had been killed because the cartel believed them to be DEA agents, which made the murders an attack on American drug enforcement efforts. The Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals affirmed the conviction in 1994 and upheld that reasoning, and the case became a reference point in American law for how far a United States court can reach across a border. Rafael Caro Quintero was convicted in Mexico for a different killing carried out the following week and served 28 years of a 40-year sentence. A Mexican appeals court released him in 2013 on a jurisdictional technicality, and the charges connected to Walker and Radelat were among those dismissed in the same ruling. He returned to drug trafficking, was placed on the FBI list of 10 most wanted fugitives in 2018 with a $20 million reward attached, and was recaptured by Mexican forces in 2022. On February 27, 2025, he was among 29 prisoners expelled from Mexican custody and flown to the United States, and he was arraigned the following day in federal court in Brooklyn. The transfer was an expulsion rather than a formal extradition, carried out under pressure from the Trump administration during a dispute over tariffs. He pleaded not guilty. In August 2025, the Justice Department announced it would not seek the death penalty against him. His trial is currently scheduled for March 2027. Two claims about this case circulate widely and are not established. The first, made in books by the Mexican journalist Anabel Hernandez, is that Joaquin Guzman was present in the restaurant that night and identified the two men as English speakers who must be DEA. That claim appears in a book and has never been established in any court. The second concerns who actually owned La Langosta, which has been attributed to different cartel figures in different accounts and has never been confirmed. John Walker's novel was never published. His daughters kept copies of the manuscript. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this one, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel more than you'd think. 8 days after Walker and Radalat were killed, in the same city, a group of men were waiting outside the American consulate for another American who had been living in Guadalajara with his wife and 3 sons. He had a lunch date with his wife that afternoon. He never reached the restaurant, and part of what was done to him over the following 30 hours was recorded. Section 2. Enrique Camarena Salazar. Enrique Camarena Salazar was born in Mexicali, on the Mexican side of the border with California, and moved to the United States with his family when he was 9 years old. He grew up in Calexico, directly across the line from the town where he was born. He served in the United States Marine Corps, then worked as a fireman, then as a police officer, then as a deputy sheriff for Imperial County. He joined the Drug Enforcement Administration in 1974. By February 1985, he had been with the agency for 11 years and was 37 years old. The agency he joined was almost new. The DEA had been created in July 1973, folding several existing federal drug enforcement bodies into a single organization, and it spent its early years building out a foreign presence it had not previously had. That expansion put American agents into resident offices in cities across Latin America, working under the authority of the local American embassy or consulate, and with no law enforcement powers of their own. Camarena's career therefore ran almost exactly parallel to the agency's own, and by the time he was posted to Guadalajara, he was among the more experienced people the DEA had operating in Mexico. He married his high school sweetheart, Geneva Camarena, who was known to everyone as Mika. They had 3 sons. In 1981, the family moved to Guadalajara, where Camarena had been posted to the DEA resident office. By the beginning of 1985, they had been living in the city for about 4 years, and a transfer back to San Diego had already been approved. They were weeks away from packing. The 4 years the family spent in Guadalajara were, in the ordinary sense, the 4 years of an American family living abroad for a parent's job. There were schools, neighbors, holidays, spent a long way from relatives, and the friction of a job that did not stop at a fixed hour. American families posted to Guadalajara in that period generally lived in the western neighborhoods of the city, sent their children to bilingual schools, and moved through a foreign community large enough that the same faces turned up at the same events. Nothing about the arrangement was covert. Camarena's employer was known, his office was known, and his home address was not a secret from anyone who cared to establish it. Mika Camarena has described that period in interviews in the decades since. The 3 boys were young enough that a move back to California would have been a minor disruption in lives that were mostly still ahead of them. The work Camarena had been doing in those 4 years is the reason the cartel came for him. A DEA resident office in a foreign city in the early 1980s was a small operation. It did not conduct raids, and it had no arrest powers on Mexican soil. What it did was develop information and pass it to Mexican authorities who could act on it. That made the entire model dependent on two things: informants willing to talk and Mexican counterparts who were not on the cartel payroll. The second of those was unreliable, which is why Camarena spent years building the first. By 1984, the network of informants he had developed across western Mexico was producing intelligence that pointed towards something in the state of Chihuahua on a scale the agency had not documented before. Confirming it required photographs from the air. The pilot who flew those passes was Alfredo Zavala Avalar, a Mexican government pilot who had spent years flying aerial reconnaissance over western Mexico for American-funded anti-drug programs. That work involved long hours over the folded mountain country where Sinaloa, Durango, and Chihuahua meet, looking for the specific color and regularity that mature marijuana plants show from altitude when the light is right. Zavala had those skills, and the eradication programs kept him busy with them. He was not an infiltrator, and he was not building a case. He flew government aircraft on government missions and reported what he found. Zavala held the aircraft steady while Camarena worked the camera over Chihuahua. What they photographed was the plantation at Rancho Buffalo. The site sat in the Chihuahua desert and functioned as an agricultural enterprise rather than a hidden plot. It had irrigation, housing, drying facilities, and a workforce that press accounts at the time put in the thousands, many of them recruited from poor communities elsewhere in Mexico and held under conditions that later reporting described as close to captivity. Nothing about an operation of that size could be concealed from local officials, and nothing about it had been. It existed because it had been paid for at every level that could have interfered with it. The raid followed on November 10th, 1984. Mexican soldiers backed by helicopters destroyed the plantation, burning thousands of tons of marijuana in a single operation. The financial damage to the Guadalajara cartel was catastrophic, and the men who had paid for protection began looking for whoever had made the raid possible. They did not have to look hard. Camarena was the DEA agent in Guadalajara, and his name and presence in the city were known. Through corrupt officials inside the Dirección Federal de Seguridad, the cartel was able to assemble information on him and on the pilot who had flown with him. On the afternoon of February 7th, 1985, at around 2 o'clock, Camarena left the DEA office near the United States consulate and started walking to meet Mika for lunch. 5 armed men, later identified as agents of the DFS, surrounded him on the street and forced him into a vehicle. At approximately the same time, on the other side of the city, Zavala was seized near the Guadalajara airport. The 2 abductions were coordinated, which required surveillance of both men's routines and the participation of officials who could supply that information. Both men were taken to a house at 881 Lope de Vega in the Jardines del Bosque neighborhood, a property belonging to Caro Quintero. Jardines del Bosque is a residential district in the western half of Guadalajara, the kind of neighborhood of walled houses and quiet streets that a prosperous family would live in. The property was not a safe house in any remote sense. It was a home in a city of 2 million people, a short drive from the consulate where Camarena worked. What happened inside that house has been established through forensic evidence, witness testimony given in later federal proceedings, and audio recordings that exist from part of the interrogation. The session lasted more than 30 hours. The questions concerned what the DEA had learned beyond what had already been acted on, who inside Mexico had been providing information, and what other investigations were running. The injuries documented by forensic examiners afterward included crushed facial bones, a fractured skull, broken ribs, and damage to the windpipe. A hole had been made in his head with a screwdriver. A doctor was reportedly brought to the property at some point during the session and administered injections intended to keep him conscious so the questioning could continue. Zavala's treatment inside the house differed in one respect. Accounts that emerged through the investigation indicate that while Camarena was given a minimal level of care aimed at keeping him alive for further questioning, Zavala received none. He was the pilot. There was less to extract from him, and the treatment reflected that. Both men died at some point around February 9th, 2 days after they were taken. Their bodies were buried, exhumed by the cartel, moved and reburied in a rural field in the neighboring state of Michoacán, roughly 60 to 75 miles southeast of Guadalajara. On March 5th, 1985, they were found. Both were wrapped in plastic, blindfolded, bound at the wrists, and gagged. Forensic examination established that both had died from blows to the head and neck. The condition of the remains and the fact that they had been moved between 2 burial sites in different states complicated the forensic work considerably, and it also established that the people responsible had access to vehicles, labor, and unmonitored rural land across a distance of some 70 miles. Camarena's remains were flown to the United States and received at North Island Naval Air Station in San Diego on March 8, 1985. Zavala's body was returned to his own family in Mexico with none of that. There was no ceremony at a naval air station, no delegation waiting, and no national press covering the arrival. The American response had no precedent in the history of cartel violence to that point. The DEA opened Operation Leyenda, the largest homicide investigation the agency had ever conducted. American authorities slowed commercial traffic at the border to a crawl by subjecting vehicles to intensive inspection, which strangled cross-border commerce and turned the case into a diplomatic emergency within days. Investigative resources moved into Mexico on a scale that had never been attempted. The Dirección Federal de Seguridad, the intelligence agency whose agents had carried out the abduction, was dismantled entirely in the aftermath. Its files were transferred, its personnel were dispersed, and a body that had operated for 4 decades as Mexico's principal domestic intelligence service ceased to exist because of what a portion of its officers had done on a Guadalajara street on a Thursday afternoon. Operation Leyenda was eventually staffed out of Los Angeles rather than Mexico, on the reasoning that any investigation run from inside the country would be compromised within days. Witnesses were relocated to the United States. Some of the men who ended up in American courtrooms were brought across the border by methods that generated their own litigation, including a Guadalajara doctor accused of keeping Camarena alive during the interrogation, who was seized in Mexico and delivered to American agents in Texas. His case reached the Supreme Court in 1992, which held that the manner of his capture did not bar an American court from trying him. He was later acquitted at trial. The arrests followed quickly once that pressure was applied. Caro Quintero was captured in Costa Rica in April 1985. Fonseca Carrillo was arrested the same month. Felix Gallardo avoided arrest until 1989. All 3 were eventually convicted in Mexican courts for their roles in the events of February 1985, and those convictions named both victims. In the United States, federal prosecutions in Los Angeles ran across years and produced convictions, appeals, and reversals in a sequence that has still not entirely closed. 2 Mexican convictions connected to the case were overturned by an American court in 2017. The case also produced something outside the legal system. In Calexico, the town where Camarena had grown up, people began wearing red ribbons in his memory. That became Red Ribbon Week, an annual drug prevention campaign that runs in American schools to this day, and that most American children encounter without ever being told whose death it came from. Schools in his home community teach his story. A federal law carries his name. A Netflix series dramatized his career for an audience of millions. Alfredo Zavala has an entry in the legal filings and a mention in accounts that usually move on within a sentence or 2. He flew the passes. He held the aircraft steady. He was taken on the same afternoon, brought to the same house, and killed in the same sequence of events, and the record of what was done to him is thinner because fewer people were asking. The legal process has continued for 4 decades and is still running. Caro Quintero released in 2013 and recaptured in 2022, was expelled from Mexico on February 27, 2025, and arraigned the following day in the Eastern District of New York before Magistrate Judge Robert Levy. He pleaded not guilty to a third superseding indictment, charging 4 counts, leading a continuing criminal enterprise that includes 10 violations, among them a murder conspiracy, 2 counts of international narcotics distribution conspiracy, and 1 count of unlawful use of firearms. More than 100 DEA agents filled the ceremonial courtroom that day. He was led to the defense table in the same handcuffs Camarena had carried in the field. He is held without bail at the Metropolitan Detention Center in Brooklyn. In March 2025, prosecutors indicated that the death penalty remained a possibility, and the court-appointed counsel qualified to handle capital cases. On August 5, 2025, the Justice Department announced it would not seek it. His trial is scheduled to begin in March 2027, and pre-trial litigation has included a government request for an anonymous and protected jury, which his defense has opposed. In March 2025, the Camarena family filed a civil lawsuit in federal court in the Southern District of California against the Sinaloa Cartel and against Caro Quintero, Fonseca Carrillo, and Felix Gallardo individually. The suit relies on the designation of Mexican cartels as foreign terrorist organizations, which took effect in February 2025 and alleges international terrorism and wrongful death. Geneva Camarena and her sons are among the plaintiffs. Camarena's sister Myrna said at the time of the filing that the family considered justice long overdue and would not stop until it was served. The family issued a statement after the Brooklyn arraignment, saying they had held on to hope for 14,631 days. One of the 3 sons, who was a child in Guadalajara in 1985, is now a Superior Court judge in San Diego. A set of claims about this case circulates widely and should be identified as claims. A former DEA agent named Hector Bereles has alleged for years that American intelligence personnel were present or involved in the events surrounding Camarena's death, and the Justice Department re-examined aspects of the case in 2019. Those allegations have not been established as fact in any court. They are contested and they remain unresolved. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this one, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel more than you'd think. The Americans killed in Guadalajara had come to Mexico as adults, for work or for a book. The next case involves 2 people who lived on the American side of the border and crossed into Mexico the way a person crosses a street. One of them worked at the United States consulate. They took their baby to a birthday party on a Saturday afternoon and never reached home. Section 3. Leslie Enriquez and Arthur Redelfs. Leslie Ann Enriquez Catton was 35 years old and worked at the United States consulate in Ciudad Juarez, in a job that involved helping American citizens who ran into trouble in Mexico. She lived in El Paso, Texas, directly across the river, and commuted over the bridge to work. Her husband, Arthur H. Redelfs, was 34 and worked as a detention officer for the El Paso County Sheriff's Department. They had an infant daughter. Enriquez was 4 months pregnant with their second child. El Paso and Ciudad Juarez function as a single metropolitan area, divided by a river and a federal boundary. Somewhere between 2 and 3 million people live in the 2 cities combined. Families are spread across both sides. People cross for work, for school, for groceries, for dentists, for funerals. For a large number of El Paso residents, going into Juarez was not a decision that required thought. And for someone employed at the American consulate, there it was simply the commute. That closeness is what makes the border economy work, and what made the violence of those years so difficult for people in El Paso to process. El Paso has for years been among the safest large cities in the United States by homicide rate. Ciudad Juarez, a few hundred yards away across the Rio Grande, was in 2010 among the most dangerous cities anywhere. The two figures belonged to the same metropolitan area, and residents crossed between them daily. The consulate itself is one of the largest American diplomatic posts in the world, by volume of business, processing visa applications and citizen services for a vast section of northern Mexico. A significant portion of its staff are locally engaged employees rather than career Foreign Service officers, meaning people hired from the surrounding population who live in the area and do the day-to-day work. Enriquez was one of those. Her job was the American Citizen Services side of the operation, which handles passports, births abroad, arrests, hospitalizations, and deaths. She spent her working life helping Americans who had gotten into difficulty in Mexico. Her job was one that a very large number of people in that region hold in some form. Locally engaged staff at American posts abroad are not diplomats and carry no diplomatic immunity. They are hired locally, paid on a local scale, and do the work that keeps a consulate running. In a post the size of Ciudad Juárez, that means hundreds of people, most of them with families on both sides of the river, going to an American government building every day and going home to a Mexican or American address afterward. By 2010, the city she worked in had become the most violent place on earth that was not at war. The reason was a fight over one crossing point. The Juárez Corridor is the single most valuable smuggling route from Mexico into the United States, because whatever passes through it enters the American interstate system directly at El Paso. For decades, that corridor had been controlled by the organization known as the Juárez Cartel, also called the Carrillo Fuentes organization, after the family that ran it. In 2008, the Sinaloa cartel moved to take it. What followed was not a series of incidents, but a sustained war between two of the largest criminal organizations in the hemisphere, fought street by street in a city of more than 1 million people. More than 2,600 people were killed in Ciudad Juárez in 2009. The homicide rate reached roughly 173 per 100,000 residents, a figure with almost no modern peacetime precedent. President Felipe Calderón deployed around 7,000 soldiers and federal police into the city. The killing continued anyway, and in 2010, it got worse. The Juárez cartel fought that war through two armed structures. The first was La Línea, made up substantially of serving and former Chihuahua police officers. The second was Barrio Azteca. Barrio Azteca is unusual among the organizations in this video because it began in the United States. It formed in the late 1980s inside the Texas prison system among inmates from El Paso as a protection group of the kind that prison populations generate. Over the following 2 decades, it expanded outward from the prisons into the streets of El Paso and then across the river into Juárez, and by the late 2000s, the Justice Department was describing it as a transnational criminal organization running money laundering, racketeering, and drug distribution on both sides of the border. Its alliance with La Línea put it directly into the war against Sinaloa, and it supplied the manpower for a great deal of the killing in Juárez. The gang's structure explains why the American government was able to prosecute it later. Barrio Azteca had members, leaders, money, and operations inside the United States, which meant American racketeering statutes reached it directly in a way they do not reach a purely Mexican organization. Orders passed from Juárez to El Paso and back. Money moved across the bridge. That made the gang legally vulnerable on the American side in a way that La Línea, operating entirely in Chihuahua, was not. The men who ran the Juárez side of that gang worked through hit teams. Assignments were passed down by telephone. Spotters were used to locate and follow targets before shooters were sent in, which meant surveillance was often running days before anything happened. January 2010 had already produced the single event that shifted how the city was described internationally. Gunmen entered a house party in the Villas de Salvarcar neighborhood, where teenagers were celebrating, and opened fire, killing 15 people, most of them students, with no involvement in anything. The attack was later attributed to a mistake about who was inside. It generated national outrage in Mexico and a presidential visit, and it established a pattern that would repeat 2 months later, which was gunmen dispatched against a target identified in advance and firing on the wrong people. On March 13, 2010, a birthday party was held for the child of a consulate employee. A number of people connected to the consulate attended, families included, and it took place at a location in Juarez. Enriquez and Redelfs went and brought their baby daughter. Also at the party were Jorge Alberto Salcido Ceniceros, who was 37, and his wife, a Mexican national employed at the same consulate, along with their 2 young children. Both families left in the afternoon. Enriquez and Redelfs got into a white Toyota sport utility vehicle with their daughter in a car seat in the back. Salcido left in a white Honda sport utility vehicle with his 2 children in the back. His wife traveled separately in another vehicle. According to the account later given by a Barrio Azteca member named Ricardo Valles de la Rosa, who was arrested that month, an Azteca leader had telephoned him days in advance and instructed him to find out where consulate employees were holding a children's party and to follow the white sport utility vehicle belonging to Redelfs. Valles de la Rosa followed the vehicle along a Juarez Avenue until he was told to fall back because the shooters had it in their sights. Moments later, he heard gunfire. He drove past the scene afterward and saw that Redelfs was dead and that Enriquez was dead beside him. Their vehicle had been pursued through the streets and fired on repeatedly. Enriquez was killed. Redelfs was killed. Their infant daughter was in the car seat in the back and was not hit. She was found in the vehicle, unhurt. The second attack happened at close to the same time, elsewhere in the city. Salcido's white Honda was fired on in the same way. He was killed at the wheel. His 2 children in the back seat were both wounded. His wife, in the separate vehicle, was unharmed and arrived to find it. 3 people were dead, 2 of them American citizens, and a 4th, Enriquez's unborn child, was counted among the victims in the American prosecutions that followed. What the United States government said in the first days was cautious and, as it turned out, wrong in one respect. State Department officials told reporters they had no indication that the victims had been targeted because of their work or their connection to the consulate, and that the consular employee had not been involved in counter-narcotics. One American official said it appeared to be a case of mistaken identity. The mistaken identity part was correct. Trial evidence in the United States later established that the hit teams had been sent after the 2 white sport utility vehicles because the occupants were taken for members of a rival gang. 2 families leaving a child's birthday party were followed and shot because their vehicles matched what the gunman had been told to look for. The funerals were held in El Paso on March 20, 2010, with police guarding the cemetery. The killings landed in Washington in the middle of an argument about money. The Merida Initiative, the American aid program funding Mexican counter-narcotics efforts, was reaching the end of its original term that year, and its renewal was being debated in Congress. Members who had been pressing the case for continued funding used the consulate murders directly. One of them, a California representative, had lost a constituent to cartel gunmen 10 weeks earlier, an American school administrator abducted from a restaurant in Durango at the end of December 2009 and found shot. Her statement described the Juarez killings as a reminder that the violence was reaching Mexicans and Americans with no connection at all to the drug trade. Ruben Redelfs, Arthur's brother, was among those who identified them publicly in the first days. Enriquez's Facebook page stayed up afterward, with an ordinary post from January still on it, and people in her network began replacing their own profile pictures in the days that followed. The response from Washington was immediate and out of proportion to anything the killing of 3 people would ordinarily produce, because 2 of the dead were American and 1 of them worked for the American government. Federal investigative resources moved into the case at a scale Mexican homicides involving American victims almost never receive. The Justice Department eventually charged 35 defendants in a third superseding indictment covering the consulate murders alongside racketeering, narcotics distribution and importation, extortion, money laundering, obstruction of justice, and retaliation against people who had given information to American law enforcement. The man identified as having ordered the killings was Arturo Gallegos Castrillon, a Barrio Azteca lieutenant who used at least 7 aliases, including Benny, Farmero, Güero, and Pecas. He was arrested in Mexico in November 2010 and extradited to the United States on June 28, 2012. In February 2014, a federal jury in El Paso found him guilty of 3 counts of murder, along with 8 other charges, including racketeering conspiracy, narcotics trafficking, narcotics importation, murder in a foreign country, and money laundering. In April 2014, United States District Judge Kathleen Cardone sentenced him to life in prison. She ordered him to pay $998,840 in restitution to the victims' families and $785,500 in forfeiture, and imposed an additional 20 years and 8 months on the remaining counts. Prosecutors stated at sentencing that Gallegos Castrillon had led the teams of assassins responsible for the consulate shootings and for nearly 1,600 other murders in the course of the war over the Juarez corridor. The 2 men who actually fired the shots were tried much later. José Guadalupe Díaz Díaz and Martín Artín Pérez Marufo, both from Chihuahua, were found guilty by a federal jury in February 2022. Trial evidence established that Diaz shot and killed Enriquez and Redelfs, and that Marufo shot and killed Salcido. On October 24, 2022, both were sentenced to life in prison on 10 counts and to 240 months on the remaining count, with 3 of the life terms running consecutively. The case has continued to produce guilty pleas since. A Barrio Azteca member named Enrique Guajardo Lopez, who used the nickname Kiki and who acted as a lookout on the day, pleaded guilty to racketeering conspiracy and to conspiracy to distribute and import narcotics. Of the 35 defendants charged, 26 had been convicted as of the Justice Department's later accounting. 1 killed himself before the conclusion of his trial. 2 remained fugitives. American officials stated that 33 of the 36 suspects connected to the consulate killings had been arrested, and that 24 of those had confessed. That is a rate of accountability with no equivalent anywhere else in this video. Every other case here involves either a partial prosecution, a collapsed one, or none at all. The reason this one is different is not that the crime was worse. It is that one of the victims was an employee of the United States government, killed while leaving a party held by other employees of the United States government, and the American federal apparatus responded to that as an attack on itself. The killings also changed how the consulate operated. American government personnel and their families in Ciudad Juarez were authorized to leave, and restrictions on where employees could travel and live were tightened across the northern border posts. Consulate staff who had commuted from El Paso for years reconsidered whether they could keep doing it. The prosecutions ran across 12 years and are still producing pleas. The man who ordered the killings was sentenced in 2014. The 2 men who fired the shots were not convicted until 2022, which meant the families waited more than a decade between the funeral and the verdict against the people who had actually pulled the triggers. Guilty pleas from lower-ranking participants have continued to be entered since. Leslie Enriquez had spent her working life at a desk handling the cases of Americans who got into trouble in Mexico. Passports lost, citizens arrested, citizens hospitalized, citizens killed. On March 13, 2010, she became one of the cases that desk existed to handle, and the child she left behind in the back of that vehicle was too young to remember either of her parents. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this one, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel more than you'd think. 11 months later, on a federal highway in central Mexico, hundreds of miles from any border, 2 American agents were driving an armored vehicle with diplomatic plates. They had been assigned together the previous afternoon and were on their way back from a routine task. The men who forced them off the road that day had been sent out looking for something else entirely. Section 4. Jaime Zapata. Jaime Zapata was born and raised in Brownsville, Texas, at the southernmost tip of the state, directly across the Rio Grande from the Mexican city of Matamoros. He joined United States Immigration and Customs Enforcement and worked for the agency's investigative arm, Homeland Security Investigations. The agency was younger than he was. Immigration and Customs Enforcement was created in 2003, assembled out of investigative and enforcement components of the old Immigration and Naturalization Service and the United States Customs Service, and folded into the newly created Department of Homeland Security after the September 11th attacks. Homeland Security Investigations is the criminal investigative arm of that agency, and its jurisdiction is broader than most people assume. It covers narcotics smuggling, human trafficking, weapons trafficking, money laundering, financial crime, and customs fraud, which in practice means anything criminal that crosses a border. By early 2011, he was 32 years old and had been assigned to Mexico, working out of the attaché office at the American Embassy in Mexico City. Brownsville is a particular kind of place to come from for this story. For people who grow up there, the border is not a policy question. It is a bridge, cross to see family, buy something, or go to a dentist. Zapata came out of that world, joined a federal agency whose entire mandate runs along that line, and was eventually posted to the other side of it. The work of an HSI agent assigned to an embassy is not what most people picture when they hear that an American agent was posted abroad. These agents do not conduct raids and have no police powers in the host country. They liaise. They sit with Mexican counterparts, share case information, work extradition paperwork, and follow money and cargo and people across a border both governments treat as a single problem. A great deal of it involves driving between offices in different cities. The arrangement that puts them there is called the attaché system, and it is how most American federal agencies operate abroad. An agency assigns personnel to an embassy or consulate, where they hold a diplomatic or quasi-diplomatic status negotiated with the host government. That status is what allows them to work openly rather than covertly, and it comes with a set of visible markers, including plates on official vehicles that identify them as belonging to a foreign mission. Those markers exist to make the personnel identifiable and therefore protected. The assumption underneath the whole system is that a host country's criminals understand what those markers mean and calculate that attacking someone carrying them brings consequences not worth accepting. Victor Avila was the other agent in the vehicle that day. He was a native of El Paso, also with Homeland Security Investigations, working the human trafficking portfolio out of the same attaché office. He and Zapata had met the afternoon before. They were not long-time partners. They had been assigned together for a specific task and were driving back from it. The road they were on was Federal Highway 57, which runs north from Mexico City through San Luis Potosi toward Monterrey and the crossings at Laredo. San Luis Potosi is not a border state and does not appear on most people's mental map of the drug war. It sits in the center of the country, and Highway 57 runs through it because that is the road connecting the capital to the industrial north. Whoever controls that stretch controls a piece of the most valuable logistics corridor in Mexico. Highway 57 carries a large share of the manufactured goods moving between central Mexico and the United States, feeding the industrial belt around Monterrey and Saltillo, and then the crossings at Nuevo Laredo. It is a road used constantly by ordinary commercial traffic, which is exactly what makes it useful to an organization moving product, and exactly what makes an armed group operating on it dangerous to everyone else using it. In early 2011, That control was contested by Los Zetas. The Zetas had a history unlike the older trafficking organizations. They were assembled deliberately in the late 1990s by Osiel Cardenas Guillen, the leader of the Gulf Cartel, who recruited soldiers out of Mexican Army Special Forces units. Those men had received training in counter-terrorism tactics, small unit combat, marksmanship, and intelligence gathering. Cardenas gave the group the radio designation Z, and what formed around it was a paramilitary wing attached to a cartel, disciplined in a way that older criminal groups had never been. The men recruited into it came largely from the Grupo Aeromóvil de Fuerzas Especiales, an air-mobile special forces unit that had itself received training from foreign militaries as part of Mexico's own counter-narcotics buildup. Deserting for cartel work was, in the plainest terms, a pay decision. A soldier in that unit earned a few $100s a month. The Gulf Cartel offered multiples of that. What the cartel got in exchange was a body of men who could plan an ambush, run counter-surveillance, handle military weapons competently, and train replacements, which is the capability older trafficking organizations had always lacked, and the reason the Zetas were able to expand as fast as they did once they went independent. Around 2010, the Zetas broke from the Gulf Cartel and began operating independently. The split touched off a war that turned the northeast of Mexico into something close to open conflict, and it changed what the organization did for money. Alongside drug smuggling, they ran extortion, kidnapping, fuel theft, and highway robbery. One of those lines of business was systematic vehicle theft. Armored SUVs were valuable both as transport and as protection, and crews were assigned specifically to take them off the highways. That is the assignment the men who attacked Zapata and Avila were carrying out, according to the evidence presented at the federal trial in Washington. They were not looking for American agents. They were looking for a vehicle. On February 15, 2011, the two agents were driving north on that road between Mexico City and Monterrey in an armored Chevrolet Suburban carrying diplomatic plates. The attack took very little time. Vehicles moved in on the Suburban and forced it off the highway. Accounts vary on the number of attackers and on whether a formal roadblock was in place, with contemporaneous reporting describing anywhere from a small group to 2 separate crews. What is established is that the agents were surrounded and their vehicle was stopped. The Suburban was armored, and the armor produced a specific problem. The doors locked automatically. When Zapata lowered his window partway to identify himself and Avila as American diplomats, gunmen fired through the opening with an AK-47 and a handgun. Avila was shot twice in the leg. Zapata was hit multiple times. By Avila's public account, a considerable period passed before help arrived, and Zapata died at a hospital in San Luis Potosi. The armoring that failed here is worth explaining because the failure was specific rather than general. An armored vehicle of that type is built around the assumption that it stays sealed. The glass, the panels, and the door structure are rated to stop rifle rounds so long as nothing opens. Once a window is down, the protection is gone at that point in the shell, and the occupants are in a metal box with a hole in it and no way to drive out. Every element of what the vehicle was designed to do depended on the agents never needing to speak to anyone through it. The reason Zapata lowered the window was that he was following the protocol he had been given, which was to identify himself as an American diplomat, because the entire premise of the attaché system is that criminals who understand what they are looking at will withdraw. The men on that road either did not understand it or did not care. The response in the United States was immediate. Zapata's body was returned to Brownsville, where a rosary and funeral were held. Federal agencies opened one of the largest investigations of the period, and the diplomatic pressure applied to Mexico in the weeks afterward followed the same pattern the Camarena killing had established 26 years earlier. Mexican authorities produced arrests quickly. Extraditions followed, which is not something Mexico had historically been willing to do at speed. and the fact that 7 men were eventually sent north to face an American jury reflects how much political weight was placed behind this particular case. The killing of an American federal agent inside Mexico had happened once before, in Guadalajara in 1985, and everyone involved understood the precedent they were operating against. The prosecutions took years and took an unusual shape. 7 Mexican nationals were extradited to the United States to face charges in Washington. Julian Zapata Espinoza, who used the nickname El Piolín and who shared a surname with the victim by coincidence, entered a guilty plea to the murder and to the attempted murder of Avila. He had been arrested in Mexico within days of the attack, along with several others, in an operation that Mexican authorities carried out under intense pressure from Washington. 2 men went to trial in 2017. José Emmanuel García Sota, known as Zafado, and Jesus Iván Quesada Piña, known as Loco, were convicted by a federal jury after a proceeding that heard from 22 witnesses, including Avila himself. Senior Judge Royce C. Lamberth presided and handed down life sentences on counts including murder of a federal officer and attempted murder of a federal officer. The convictions did not stay settled. In 2019, the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals vacated 2 of the 4 counts, holding that the statutes covering murder and attempted murder of a federal officer had not been clearly extended by Congress to conduct occurring entirely outside the United States. The convictions on the remaining counts survived, and the men stayed in prison, but the specific finding that they had murdered an American federal officer did not. The case returned to the district court, and resentencing took place in May 2023. Avila attended. The reason the appellate problem arose at all goes back to how American criminal statutes are written. Congress drafts most criminal law with domestic conduct in mind, and courts will only apply a statute to conduct abroad when Congress has made that intention clear in the text. Prosecutors in cases like this one therefore have to build charges around the handful of provisions that do reach overseas, which is why the racketeering statute used in the Walker and Radelat prosecution 20 years earlier had become a standard tool. The Zapata prosecution used the federal officer statutes instead, and the appellate court found that Congress had not extended those particular provisions beyond American soil. A dimension of this case has generated a great deal of argument and needs to be described carefully, because the version that circulates online is more confident than the record supports. Weapons recovered in connection with the attack were traced, and at least one was linked to a straw purchasing operation in Texas connected to the federal program known as Operation Fast and Furious. Under that program, agents allowed firearms to be sold to suspected traffickers in the hope of following them to higher-level figures. In practice, agents lost track of large numbers of the weapons, and some turned up at crime scenes on both sides of the border. The program had already produced a national scandal after a weapon connected to it was found at the scene of a Border Patrol agent's killing in Arizona in December 2010. Texas firearms purchasers were later prosecuted in connection with weapons that reached cartel hands. The precise attribution of specific weapons in the Zapata case is documented in Justice Department Inspector General material and in congressional records, and any firm claim about it should be built from those documents rather than from summaries. The resentencing in 2023 left both men serving life terms on the counts that survived, which included conspiracy and firearms offenses tied to the attack. From the standpoint of time served, the appellate ruling changed very little. What it changed was what the record formally says about what happened on that road. The extradition of 7 men to face an American jury for a killing on Mexican soil was unusual on its own terms. Mexico had resisted sending nationals north for decades, and the political decision to do it here was made because the victim was a federal agent of the United States government. Victor Avila retired from federal service and became a public figure on border and cartel policy, testifying, giving interviews, and appearing at events built around the argument that American personnel in Mexico are exposed in ways the public does not understand. His account includes an allegation that the American embassy had issued a warning against travel on Highway 57 roughly 3 weeks before the attack, and that the mission was ordered anyway. That allegation comes from Avila and from advocacy organizations working with him. It is not part of the trial record, and it has not been independently established. He has also been consistently critical of the appellate outcome, which, from the perspective of the surviving agent, meant watching 2 of the 4 counts against the men convicted of killing his partner be vacated on a technical ground, whatever the legal reasoning behind it. American federal personnel posted to Mexico travel in armored vehicles, carry diplomatic plates, and operate on a set of assumptions about what an organization will and will not do to a person carrying that status. Those assumptions have failed twice in documented prosecuted cases. They failed in Guadalajara in 1985. They failed again on a federal highway in San Luis Potosí in 2011, when a crew whose assignment that day was stealing trucks decided that the armor and the plates were not a reason to stop. Jaime Zapata was 32. He had been in the country doing the job for less than a year. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this one, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel more than you'd think. The next case is the first in this list where no one was ever charged with anything. 2 Americans who had lived in Mexico for 3 decades in a mountain town outside Monterrey were found in their own house with electrical cords around their necks. What the region around them had become by that winter is documented in detail. What happened inside that house is not. Section 5. John and Wanda Cassius. John Cassius and his wife Wanda moved from Amarillo, Texas, to the mountains south of Monterrey, Mexico, around 1979, and they were still living there 33 years later. He was 76 years old by then, and she was 67. They were Baptist missionaries. They founded and ran a church in the community of El Cercado, in the municipality of Santiago, Nuevo León, called the First Fundamentalist Independent Baptist Church, affiliated with the Global Independent Baptist Fellowship. El Cercado is a village inside the Santiago municipality, sitting along the road that climbs from the Monterrey Plain into the mountains, and it functions as one of a string of small settlements that the larger town administers. Their home church in the United States was Liberty Baptist Church in Lewisville, Texas. They maintained a website where they posted updates for supporters. They worked across Nuevo León and traveled to Zacatecas, San Luis Potosí, and Coahuila. They raised 10 children. Amarillo, the city they left, sits in the Texas Panhandle, roughly 800 miles north of the border. Moving from there to the mountains of Nuevo León in 1979 meant relocating to a country whose language, legal system, and church structure were unfamiliar, with no institutional employer, no fixed salary, and no plan to come back. They did it in their early 40s and were still doing it in their 70s. They had been in Santiago long enough that the church they founded had produced its own generation. Children who had been baptized there in the 1980s were bringing their own children by 2012. A congregation that small, in a town that size, is not an institution so much as an extended family with a building, and the couple who started it had spent longer running it than most people spend in a career. Independent Baptist mission work of the kind they did runs on a specific and precarious model. There is no denominational headquarters issuing salaries. A missionary family is supported directly by individual congregations in the United States, usually small ones, that commit to sending a fixed amount every month. In exchange, the family sends back updates, prayer requests, photographs, and accounts of what the money is doing. That relationship is why most of what is known about John and Wanda Cassius comes from a website they maintained themselves, rather than from any institutional record. They were funded by people in Texas who had met them. It also explains why they had been in Mexico for 3 decades and were still there in their 70s. There was no retirement structure to move into, and no organization to transfer them somewhere safer. The church in El Cercado existed because they had built it. Leaving would have meant ending it. Santiago is the kind of place that appears in Mexican tourism material. It sits at the foot of the Sierra Madre Oriental, about 20 miles south of Monterrey, near a reservoir and a set of waterfalls, in a valley that has drawn weekend visitors from the city for generations. The Federal Tourism Ministry awarded it the designation of Pueblo Mágico in 2006, a program that identifies towns considered worth promoting and protecting for their character and history. For most of the years, the Casillas family lived there. It was a quiet town where a foreign couple running a small church was unremarkable. Protestant mission work in that part of Mexico occupies a particular social position that is worth understanding. Mexico is overwhelmingly Catholic, and an independent Baptist congregation in a small Nuevo León town is a minority institution serving a small number of families. That smallness cuts both ways. It kept the Casillas family out of any conflict with larger institutions, and it also meant they had no larger institutions standing behind them. There was no diocese, no regional office, and no organizational security apparatus. There was a building, a congregation, and two people in their 70s who had built both. 4 years after Santiago received that designation, its mayor was kidnapped and murdered. Edelmiro Cavazos was 38 years old and had been in office less than a year when armed men took him from outside his home in August 2010. His body was found 3 days later on a road outside town, blindfolded and bound. Several of the men arrested in connection with the killing were municipal police officers from Santiago, including members of the detail assigned to protect him. That fact reorganizes the 18 months that followed for anyone living in that valley. A portion of the police in Santiago were working for the people the rest of the town needed protection from, and the demonstration of it had been public. Anyone deciding whether to report a threat, or a strange vehicle, or a phone call demanding money, was making that decision knowing what had happened to the man at the top of the local government. The wider region was in worse shape. Los Zetas and the Gulf Cartel had turned on each other and were fighting through Nuevo León, Tamaulipas, and Coahuila. Monterrey, which had spent decades as the wealthiest and most industrial city in Mexico and had marketed itself internationally as the safe, business-friendly alternative to everywhere else in the country, came apart over roughly 2 years. Gun battles moved into commercial districts, bodies appeared on major roads, companies that had placed regional headquarters there began moving executives out, private schools altered their hours, restaurants that had stayed open late for decades started closing at dusk. The American consulate in Monterrey eventually reclassified the city as a post where dependents of United States government personnel could not accompany their families, which is a designation normally applied to war zones. In August 2011, gunmen entered a casino in Monterrey, called the Casino Royale, in the middle of a weekday afternoon, doused the ground floor with fuel, and set it on fire with people inside. 52 people died, most of them women, most of them trapped upstairs in an area with no usable exit, most of them killed by smoke. The attack was attributed to Los Zetas and was understood at the time to be connected to extortion demands the business had not met. It remains one of the deadliest single attacks of the entire Mexican drug war, and it happened about 20 miles from the Casillas house. John Casillas described what he was watching in a dispatch posted to the couple's website in the summer of 2011. He wrote that the wealthy were fleeing to Canada and the United States for protection, and that when they came back to renew their visas, the cartel was waiting for them, and would either kill them or take them. He wrote that the only hope for the Mexican people was Jesus in them. According to friends at their home church, the couple had discussed with members of the congregation what they wanted done if anything happened to them, and had made clear that if they were ever kidnapped, no one was to pay a ransom. Karen Mosley, the secretary at Liberty Baptist, told reporters afterward that they had opportunities to come back to the United States and did not take them because the people in Santiago were their people and family does not get abandoned. She also said the couple had stopped allowing visitors from Texas to come down to the property on the grounds that it was no longer safe enough to bring anyone else into. Church groups from Louisville that had traveled to the area every other year stopped making the trip around 4 years before the killings. That account of the ransom pact comes from the church and the family. It has not been documented anywhere else. On Tuesday, January 31st, 2012, their son Sean, who lived in Monterey, drove out to the house around 4 in the afternoon to pick up a trailer. He went inside and found Wanda lying on the floor with an electrical cord around her neck and a wound on her head from a blunt object. He initially thought his father had been taken. 4 or 5 hours later, a forensic investigator told him that John's body had been found in a storage room in a small building on the property. He also had an electrical cord around his neck. Both were in their 70s. Neither had been armed, and neither had any security arrangement at the property beyond ordinary locks. Both had been strangled. The house had been ransacked. Missing from it were computers, a plasma television, and a safe that had been chiseled out of the wall. The couple's Chevrolet Suburban was gone from the property. The safe is the detail that shaped how investigators read the scene. Removing a safe that has been fixed into a wall takes time, tools, and more than one person. It is not the work of an opportunist who has entered a house, expecting it to be empty, and then panicked. Whoever was in that house was there long enough to strangle 2 people, work a safe out of masonry, load a television and several computers, and drive a vehicle off the property, which suggests either that they knew the house was isolated enough to allow it, or that they had no particular reason to hurry. The Nuevo León Attorney General's office opened an investigation. As of the funeral held at their own church that Thursday, no arrests had been made. The state was, at that moment, running an investigative apparatus under conditions that made a case like this close to impossible to work. Nuevo León had spent the previous 2 years purging municipal police departments across the metropolitan area after repeated findings that officers were on cartel payrolls. Investigators who pursued organized crime cases in that state during that period faced a documented risk of being killed for it. A robbery homicide with no witnesses, no surviving family in the immediate area, and 2 victims who were foreign nationals in their 70s was never going to receive sustained attention against that backdrop. Nuevo León had spent the 2 years before their deaths dismissing and replacing municipal police officers across the Monterrey metropolitan area after repeated findings that officers were drawing cartel salaries. Entire departments were stood down and rebuilt from scratch, and the state moved toward a unified force because individual town departments had proven impossible to keep clean. In Santiago, the force had been implicated in the murder of the town's own mayor. The officers who would have taken a report from anyone in that valley in January 2012 were working inside an institution that had recently been found to be part of the problem. The funeral meant that the congregation buried the 2 people who had started it. Benjamin Franson traveled down from Liberty Baptist in Louisville. The bodies were then taken north to Texas, back to the home church that had been sending support for 3 decades, for a second service in a country the couple had left in their 40s and had not lived in since. Their eldest child, Valerie Alirez, lived in Greeley, Colorado. Sean lived in Monterey. The other 8 were scattered. No suspect in the murder of John and Wanda Casillas was ever publicly charged. No cartel was ever named in a court filing in connection with their deaths. Reporting at the time reached what one account described as a tentative conclusion that organized crime was involved, and that conclusion rested almost entirely on where they lived and when. The mayor of their town had been murdered by his own police 18 months earlier. 52 people had burned to death in a casino in the nearest city 6 months earlier. 2 American missionaries were found strangled in a ransacked house in the middle of that. The inference is reasonable, and it is not a finding. On the official record, this is an unsolved robbery homicide in a region controlled by a cartel. That phrase covers a great deal of what happened to civilians in northeastern Mexico between 2010 and 2013. Nuevo León recorded a sharp rise in homicide across those years, and a substantial share of the cases opened in that period were never closed. Families in Monterrey and the towns around it spent years pressing state prosecutors for movement on individual cases and receiving very little. The Casillas case sits inside that larger set rather than apart from it, with the single difference that the two victims held American passports, which generated a few days of coverage in Texas and then nothing further. The couple's supporters in Texas learned about it through the church rather than through any official channel. That is how these deaths generally reach the people who need to know about them. There is no notification system that reaches a small congregation in Louisville, and the American government's involvement in a case like this begins and ends with confirming that 2 citizens have died. There was no consulate case officer working it, no federal agency taking it over, and no American statute that reached it. It was a Nuevo León state matter, in a state that in that same 12-month period was dealing with the Casino Royale prosecution, an active war between 2 cartels and a municipal police force in the very town where the couple died that had already been implicated in the murder of its own mayor. A cartel ordering a killing and a burglary crew committing one in a place where a cartel has removed all consequence are 2 different events that produce identical outcomes for the people in the house. Several of the cases still ahead in this video sit in exactly that space. Some have named suspects who were local criminals rather than cartel operatives. Some have no suspects at all. The house is on a property in a valley that people from Monterrey still drive out to on weekends. The church they founded continued after them. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this one, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel more than you'd think. The next case moves to a bay on the Sea of Cortez, where about 100 Americans keep houses, where people left their doors unlocked, and where nothing violent had ever happened. Then a retired couple heard a noise outside at midnight, and one of them went to look. The man eventually arrested for it was a local everybody already knew, and the case against him fell apart in a courtroom in 5 days. Section 6. Ray Ball and Joanne Butler. Ray Edgar Ball and Joanne Butler were retirees from Prescott, Arizona, who spent part of every year in a waterfront house in Bahia de Los Angeles, a fishing village on the Sea of Cortez side of the Baja California Peninsula. He was 72 years old. She was 69. Butler was an artist, and there were sculptures and paintings around the property that people walking past stopped to look at. They kept a 22-foot fishing boat, a McKee craft with a large outboard motor, which they used constantly. They had a black Labrador named Bart, an older dog they had adopted out of the population of strays that Americans in Baja tend to end up rescuing. Bart was never on a leash and was rarely seen apart from one or the other of them. Bahia de Los Angeles is not on the way to anywhere. It sits roughly 417 miles from San Diego and about 380 miles south of the border, reached by a long drive down the peninsula on Highway 1 and then a turn east across the desert to the Gulf. A line of islands shelters the bay, and the water is clear and full of fish, which is the entire reason the settlement exists. Around 1,000 people live there permanently. At least 100 of them are American. The drive to reach it explains most of what the place is. Highway 1 runs the length of the Baja Peninsula from Tijuana to Cabo San Lucas, and for long stretches through the central desert, it is a 2-lane road with no shoulder, no lighting, no cell coverage, and very few settlements. The turnoff to the bay comes at a junction in that desert and runs about 40 miles east to the water. There is no other route in. Anyone who reaches Bahia de Los Angeles has made a deliberate 10 to 12-hour drive from the border to get there, which filters out casual traffic entirely and is the reason the community stayed small and stayed the same for decades. The Americans in that bay are not a resort population. Many of them have been going down for 30 or 40 years. They bought or built houses on the water and spend weeks or months at a time there, fishing and doing very little else. Residents ran a VHF radio network to stay in contact, using channel 68 as the hailing channel and then switching to another channel for the actual conversation, so the first stayed clear. It is the kind of place where everyone knows whose truck is whose, and where people did not lock their doors. The local economy runs on fishing and on the Americans. Commercial fishermen work the bay and the islands. Small operations run sport fishing charters and rent pangas. A handful of restaurants, a few small hotels and a couple of general stores serve a population that swells and shrinks with the seasons. Building a house, maintaining it, watching it through the months an owner is away and doing the work on it are all local jobs, which means the foreign houses are also the local employer. That arrangement runs on trust in both directions and had run without serious incident for 30 or 40 years. The property arrangements in a place like that are worth explaining because they shape a great deal about how these communities function. Mexican law restricts direct foreign ownership of land within 50 kilometers of the coastline. Foreigners who want a house on the water generally hold it through a bank trust, or they build on land belonging to a Mexican family and hold the structure rather than the ground beneath it, or they operate on an informal arrangement with a local landowner that has been running for so long nobody questions it. All three arrangements produce the same practical result, which is that an American with a house in coastal Baja is usually connected by paperwork or by handshake to a specific local family, and everyone in the settlement knows which family that is. The nearest consular assistance was in Tijuana, most of a day's drive north. The nearest facility capable of a forensic examination was in Ensenada. Everything that happened in the first hours after a violent crime in that bay was handled by whoever lived nearby, because there was nobody else. On the Friday afternoon before it happened, Butler walked past a neighbor's porch with the dog and stopped to visit. She had just given Bart a bath. They sat in the shade for a while and talked about the radio network. That neighbor had already had a problem of his own 2 nights earlier. In the middle of the night, he had heard men talking outside his house in the dark and had confronted them. Nothing came of it at the time. What happened at the Ball and Butler house began around midnight on June 2nd, 2018. A neighbor was woken by gunfire, then heard what sounded like metal scraping. Looking outside, he saw 2 men using a vehicle to pull the boat and its trailer toward the water. The vehicle got stuck and buried itself in the sand. The men abandoned it, fired more shots, and left. The reconstruction local officials and neighbors put together afterward is that Ball heard the noise and went out to investigate. Friends believed he probably picked up a baseball bat on the way, which is what people who knew him said they would have expected. He opened the back door and was shot. Butler was shot in the legs. The dog was killed. State officials pronounced the couple dead at 2:46 in the morning. The bodies were found by another neighbor, Roger Mears, a former off-road racing champion with a house in the bay. There is a discrepancy in the record about how many times Ray Ball was shot. The figure that appears in most mainstream reporting, sourced back to the San Diego Union Tribune, is 18 gunshot wounds. Mexico News Daily reported 9. The San Diego Reader, which produced the most detailed reporting anyone has done on the case, referenced at least 12 shots and 12 9mm casings recovered at the scene. Butler's wounds are given consistently across every account as 2, both to the legs. What every version agrees on is that a great deal more ammunition was used than was necessary on 2 people in their 70s over a boat that the men firing had already failed to move. The response that followed was shaped by where this happened. Bahia de Los Angeles has no hospital and no permanent prosecutorial presence. State officials had to travel in from Ensenada, several hours away across the peninsula, before any formal investigation could begin. By the time forensic personnel reached the property, A significant amount of time had passed. The community had been the first responders, as it is for everything else there. The Ball and Butler killings were not the only American deaths in that municipality that year. On January 8, 2018, 5 months earlier, a 75-year-old American named Charles Lewis Crabtree was bludgeoned to death with a hammer in the same Ensenada municipality. A 28-year-old suspect was reported in custody. The municipality those two killings fall under is worth understanding because it distorts how the statistics read. Ensenada is the largest municipality in Mexico by land area, covering a vast stretch of the northern Baja Peninsula from the Pacific across to the Sea of Cortez and hundreds of miles south. Bahia de Los Angeles sits inside it, as do dozens of other small settlements separated from one another by desert. A single prosecutorial office and a single set of investigators are responsible for the whole of it. A homicide in a coastal village, hundreds of miles from the municipal seat, is worked, if it is worked at all, by people who have to drive most of a day to reach the scene. Bahia de Los Angeles has no bank and effectively no card infrastructure outside a couple of businesses. Americans living there run on cash, brought down from the border, sometimes several months' worth at a time, and they keep tools, outboard motors, generators, fishing equipment, and vehicles on properties that stand empty for long stretches. The 22-foot boat in the yard was worth a substantial amount of money, and, in a bay where the economy runs on fishing, was an asset that could be used or sold immediately. It sat in the open at a house belonging to two people in their 70s. The Crabtree killing in January had drawn almost no coverage outside Baja. He was 75, he was American, and he died in the same municipality 5 months before Ball and Butler. Local official Octavio Lopez described the June killings to the press as an attempted robbery in which a man went out to defend his property and was shot for it. He also said it was the first time anything like it had happened there. Tom Mitchell, a San Diego resident who had kept a home in the Bay for 4 decades, told the Union Tribune that the community had no memory of a shooting and that whoever did this had not hesitated. The nearest consular assistance was in Tijuana, most of a day's drive north. The nearest hospital capable of a forensic examination was in Ensenada. The 2 Americans killed in that house were processed by a system whose closest working component was several hundred miles from the bay, and everything that happened in the first hours after the shooting was handled by neighbors. The investigation took 18 months to produce an arrest and then 5 days to lose it. On December 13, 2019, Baja California authorities arrested a man named Hector Daniel Quiñones Cortez, known locally as El Yillo. He was a resident of Bahia de Los Angeles. The American residents knew who he was. He was known in the settlement as a drug trafficker and as a thief, and he was suspected of a long list of home burglaries in the area. The arrest rested on statements from 3 separate witnesses, all of whom identified him as involved in the attempted boat theft and the killings. On December 18th, 5 days later, at the hearing to formally charge him, his attorney presented the same 3 witnesses. All 3 recanted, telling the court their earlier statements had been given under pressure from police. The judge, José Luis Castañeda, found the evidence insufficient and released him. Mexican criminal procedure makes that outcome easier to reach than the American equivalent would. Under the accusatorial system Mexico adopted nationally in 2016, a judge at that stage is deciding whether to bind a suspect over for trial, which requires the prosecution to present enough evidence to justify continuing. Witness statements taken during the investigation carry considerably less weight than testimony given live in a hearing, and when the witnesses appear and repudiate what they said, the prosecution is left with very little. In a case built almost entirely on 3 identifications, 3 recantations end it. What happened around those recantations is the subject of allegations that circulate in Baja crime reporting, and that should be labeled as allegations. It has been claimed that the witnesses and their families were threatened before the hearing, and that a defense attorney named Ruben Arenivar was connected to those threats. Arenivar was himself found murdered in Ensenada on April 24, 2020. None of that has been established in any court. The unit that eventually killed him is stationed at San Quintin, roughly 200 miles north of the bay, and covers a stretch of the peninsula where the army's presence is intermittent rather than permanent. Soldiers move through the central desert in operations that last days and then leave. A man wanted in connection with a double homicide, released by a court, could live openly in a settlement of 1,000 people for a year before that presence and his movements happened to intersect. El Yeo did not go to trial. Sometime after his release, reported at around January 2021, he was killed by Mexican soldiers of the 67th Infantry Battalion, based at San Quintin, following a vehicle pursuit and a gun battle in the desert near Catavina and El Marmol. No court has determined whether the men who came for the boat were acting alone, as part of a local crew, or on behalf of anyone above them. The only person arrested was a known trafficker who walked out of a courtroom 5 days later and was shot dead by the army about a year after that. The 18 months between the killings and that arrest ran in a community of 1,000 people, where the local suspect pool was small, where the case had been covered by the San Diego Union Tribune and picked up nationally, and where the American Embassy was aware of it. Bahia de Los Angeles had run for decades on an assumption everyone there shared, which was that this was somewhere the rest of Mexico's problems had not reached. After June 2018, people in that community started locking their doors. The San Diego Reader went down and talked to the Americans who live there and published a long account the following September. What it recorded was a community trying to hold two incompatible ideas at once. These were people who had spent 30 and 40 years in that bay, who had raised families there and could name every household on the road, and who did not want to believe that what happened was anything more than an aberration. They had also begun to notice things they had previously filed away, burglaries that had been increasing, men in the dark outside houses, a local everyone knew to be a thief and a trafficker, operating year after year without any consequence. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this one, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel more than you'd think. The next case involves an American who moved to Mexico specifically because he believed it was freer and safer than the country he had left, and who said so repeatedly on camera. He was shot at his own front gate 8 months after the last of those videos. Nobody has ever been charged, and after 7 years, nobody can say with any confidence who did it. Section 7. John Galton Shane Kress was 26 years old and had been living in Acapulco, Mexico for about 3 years under the name John Galton. The name was a pseudonym taken from the hero of Ayn Rand's novel Atlas Shrugged, a figure treated as a kind of patron saint by people who believe the state has no right to exist at all. Almost everyone who knew him in Mexico knew him by that name rather than his own. He was in Acapulco because he had left the United States rather than face prosecution. In early 2016, he and his partner, who went by Lily Forrester and whose real name was Miranda Webb, were facing felony charges connected to marijuana. The specific charge involved manufacture of a controlled substance, meaning cannabis extract, which Webb has said she used for chronic pain. They described facing up to 25 years each, rather than fight the case they left, and by their own account, crossed into Mexico without passports. One gap in that account is worth noting. When the Associated Press searched for federal court records under the name John Galton after his death, they found none. That does not mean the charges were invented, since state-level charges would not appear in a federal search, and he was using a pseudonym throughout. It does mean that the version of his own legal situation he told on camera has never been independently verified. What the couple built in Acapulco was modest. They rented a house high above the city in a rough neighborhood for somewhere around $400 a month. Webb blew glass and sold pipes. They made videos. They were early and enthusiastic about cryptocurrency at a moment when that overlapped heavily with a particular strain of American libertarianism. The legal situation they had fled is worth setting out because it is specific to that period. By 2016, a growing number of American states had legalized marijuana in some form, while federal law continued to classify it as a Schedule I controlled substance. That gap produced enormous variation in exposure depending on which side of a state line a person was standing on. Concentrate manufacture in particular carried heavy penalties in several states because the extraction process involves flammable solvents and was charged in some jurisdictions alongside offenses relating to the danger of the process itself rather than the drug. Two people facing that set of charges in one state could have been operating a licensed business in another. Acapulco itself had been, within living memory, the most glamorous beach destination in the Western Hemisphere. In the 1950s and 1960s, it was where Hollywood went, a city of cliff divers and beachfront hotels that appeared in films and on postcards and in the itineraries of American honeymooners. What ended it was the fragmentation of the Beltran-Leyva organization after 2009, which broke the city's criminal structure into competing pieces that then fought each other neighborhood by neighborhood. Tourism collapsed with it. Hotels emptied. Property values fell. By the middle of the following decade, Acapulco was recording homicide rates that placed it among the highest of any city on earth. The violence had also relocated within the city. Guerrero State around Acapulco was contested by several criminal organizations, and the city was divided among groups fighting over local retail drug sales and extortion rather than over international trafficking routes. That kind of dispute plays out where people live rather than where tourists go, which is why the strip along the bay continued operating while the neighborhoods climbing the hills behind it did not. Those conditions are the reason several hundred Americans ended up living there on purpose. Property was cheap because the tourism economy had collapsed. Enforcement of almost anything was minimal. The city was large enough to disappear into and had an international airport with direct flights to the United States. The organizing structure for that community was a conference. Since 2015, a man named Jeff Berwick had been running an annual event in Acapulco called Anacapulco, held every February and drawing attendees in the thousands. The program mixed political philosophy with practical seminars on making money through cryptocurrency, and it produced a floating population of expatriates who came for the conference and then stayed. Galton and Webb were part of that community, and in 2018, they broke away to run their own event, which they called Anacapulco, using the cryptocurrency term for a split. Anacapulco grew every year it ran. By 2018 and 2019, the program filled several days at a hotel on the bay, with a schedule of speakers covering political theory, personal sovereignty, alternative medicine, and above all, cryptocurrency investment. Attendees paid for tickets, and a secondary economy of side events, workshops, and private dinners grew around the main conference. Bitcoin had gone from an obscure technical project to a mainstream financial story across those same years, and the people who had bought early and held were sitting on money that had appeared without a bank, an employer, or a government anywhere in the chain. Galton talked about Mexico on camera repeatedly, and what he said is now the most quoted thing about him. In one video, he said he would call Acapulco safer than any big city he had lived in the United States, and specifically, safer than Chicago. In another, he said there were pockets of freedom all over the world for anyone willing to live in freedom. What the couple were selling is worth stating plainly. Webb blew glass and made pipes, which is a legal cottage industry in most places, and which they sold to the conference crowd and online. The house also had marijuana growing in it. Both facts have been reported consistently, and neither is disputed. The community around him had already had one death. Nathan Freeman, a figure in the Anacapulco circle, died in 2019 under circumstances that were disputed within the group and never resolved publicly. No established connection exists between that death and what happened to Galton. On the night of February 1, 2019, Galton, Webb, and a friend named Jason Henzer had finished eating at the house. Henzer was 43. Armed men arrived at the property. Accounts vary between the men coming through the gate and storming the house. What is consistent across accounts is that the shooting was fast and appeared targeted rather than random. Webb, who witnessed it, said the gunman went straight for Galton and for Henzer. Galton was killed at the gate. Henzer was shot 3 times, in the armpit, the hand, and the leg. Webb was physically unharmed, and Galton is said to have shielded her and taken the bulk of the fire. Within hours of the shooting, footage recorded by 2 of the 3 people present was on the open internet and being shared through a community of several thousand people who knew the victim personally. That produced a very large volume of commentary, theorizing, and accusation before Mexican authorities had processed the scene, and it produced it among people with no access to any evidence. A significant part of what circulates about this killing today traces back to what was posted in the first 48 hours. Both survivors posted videos to Facebook within minutes. Webb's is a recording of a person in the middle of the worst moment of her life, saying that someone had shown up right after they finished eating and shot John and Henzer, that John was dead at the gate, that Henzer was in the other room, and asking anyone listening to please come. Henzer recorded himself in a blood-soaked shirt, saying he had 3 gunshot wounds, that he was not doing well, and that he believed it was retaliation for something. Both videos circulated widely within hours, which is a large part of why this case is remembered at all. Henzer reached a private hospital, was treated for the 3 wounds, and released the same day. He is believed to have left the country afterward. The speed with which those videos circulated is a feature of this case that has no equivalent in the others in this list. Within hours of the shooting, footage recorded by 2 of the 3 people present was on the open internet and being shared through a community of several thousand people who knew the victim personally. That produced an enormous volume of commentary, theorizing, and accusation before Mexican authorities had processed the scene, and it produced it among people with no access to evidence. A great deal of what circulates about this killing today traces back to speculation posted in the first 48 hours. When Mexican police searched the house, they found marijuana plants, equipment for processing drugs, and the glass pipes Webb made. That detail is where the arguments about this case begin. It can be read as evidence that the couple were exactly what they said they were, 2 people who had fled a marijuana charge and were quietly growing marijuana. It can also be read as evidence that they were operating in a retail market in a city where local organizations control who sells what. Nothing in the public record settles it. The theories about who killed him have never narrowed. Some in his own community, including the activist Larkin Rose, said publicly in the days afterward that all indications pointed to a hit by Mexican drug cartels, which was speculation offered within 72 hours by someone who was not in Mexico. Other theories held that it was a robbery that went wrong, or that it came out of a dispute inside the expatriate community, or that it was connected to the grow operation and to whoever considered that neighborhood theirs. No one has ever been charged. There is no public record of Guerrero state authorities announcing a suspect, a motive, or a prosecution in the death of Shane Kress. The people best positioned to describe what happened were also the people least able to pursue it. Miranda Webb had witnessed the killing and was in the country illegally by her own account, having crossed without a passport in 2016 while facing charges at home. Going to Mexican authorities meant identifying herself to a state that could deport her into an outstanding American warrant. Jason Henzer had been shot 3 times and left the country. The community around them consisted of foreign nationals on tourist entries with an ideological objection to dealing with police at all. There was no family in Acapulco to press the prosecutor's office, no employer to make calls, and no consular case with a name on it that matched the name everybody knew him by. And Acapulco continued after his death. The conference ran again the following February, in the same city, with attendance in the thousands, and it has run in the years since. Jeff Berwick has kept organizing it. The conditions behind that are not specific to this case. Guerrero in 2019 was recording thousands of homicides a year, and Acapulco alone was producing bodies at a rate that overwhelmed any normal investigative capacity. Mexican state prosecutors work under caseloads that make sustained investigation of any individual killing rare, and a case involving a foreign national with no local family, a pseudonym instead of a name, an outstanding warrant in his own country, and a marijuana grow in his house, was never going to sit near the top of that pile. Rent of $400 a month in Acapulco in 2019 did not buy a place on the bay. It bought a place in the hillside neighborhoods where the fighting over retail drug territory was happening, in a city where the division between the tourist strip and the barrios above it was the division between two different security situations. In 2022, HBO released a documentary series called The Anarchists, directed by Todd Schrammke and produced with Blumhouse, which followed the Acapulco community over several years and included the killing. The filmmakers had been in contact with Galton by text on the day he died. The series is the most thorough account of that community that exists, and it did not establish who killed him. Schrammke has been open about that. What the series does document is the shape of the community in the months before and after. It shows people who had moved their entire lives to a foreign city on the strength of a shared belief, discovering that the belief did not come with any of the protections they had left behind. There was no consulate handling this for them. There was no functioning police process to appeal to. What the group had available after one of them was shot at his own gate was a set of Facebook videos and a great deal of argument. Miranda Webb's situation after 2022 is not documented in the available sources. Jason Henzer declined to comment publicly after the initial video. Of the 10 cases in this video, this is the one where the cartel attribution is weakest, and it would be dishonest to present it any other way. What is established is that an American who had left his own country to avoid prosecution was living in one of the most violent cities in the world, in a neighborhood on the hillside, growing marijuana, and that a group of armed men came to his gate and shot him and his friend and left his partner alive. Everything past that point is inference. Acapulco recorded well over 1,000 homicides in 2019. The overwhelming majority produced no arrest, no suspect, and no coverage outside local media. Shane Kress was one of them, and the only reason his name is known at all outside Guerrero is that he had spent 3 years making videos about how safe he felt. And Acapulco continued after his death. The conference ran again the following February, with attendance in the thousands, in the same city, and it has run in the years since. He said there were pockets of freedom all over the world for anyone willing to live in freedom. He said it in a video that is still online. He was 26. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this one, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel more than you'd think. 9 months after Acapulco, on a dirt road in Sonora, 3 women from an American settlement drove into an area where the men manning the checkpoints had recently been replaced by people nobody recognized. 14 children were in the vehicles. What happened over the following 6 hours produced arrests, a judgment of more than $4 billion in a North Dakota courtroom, and a monument. Section 8. The LeBaron and Langford families. Ronita Maria Miller, Donna Ray Langford, and Christina Marie Langford Johnson were residents of La Mora, a settlement of around 300 people in the high desert country of Sonora, about 70 miles south of Douglas, Arizona. Like Colonia LeBaron in Chihuahua, it had been founded by families from a fundamentalist Mormon movement that broke from the mainstream church generations ago. The residents held dual American and Mexican citizenship. They farmed, raised cattle, and built houses, and they were conspicuous in the region for their fair hair and light skin, and for the size of their homes relative to their neighbors. The community had been living alongside cartel violence for decades, and its history with it was direct. 10 years earlier, Benjamin LeBaron had been dragged from his house in Chihuahua and shot in a cemetery for organizing against exactly this. The families absorbed that, mourned, and kept going. The geography around La Mora is part of why the events of November 2019 unfolded the way they did. The settlement sits in the Sierra Madre Occidental, near the Sonora and Chihuahua state line, in mountain country cut by dirt roads that predate any paved route. Those roads are the only practical way to travel between the settlements on either side of the line, and they are also useful to anyone moving product north toward the border without passing a federal checkpoint. Cell coverage across most of that terrain is absent. A vehicle that leaves La Mora heading for Chihuahua is out of contact for hours by design, not by accident, which is why the families in the convoy could not call for help and why nobody in the settlement knew anything had happened until a 13-year-old walked in. What changed in the months before November 2019 is documented and matters a great deal. La Mora had reached a working accommodation with the criminal organization that dominated its area, a Sinaloa-linked group known as Los Salazar. That accommodation was not a partnership, it was the ordinary arrangement of a civilian community in cartel territory, which is that everyone understands the rules and nobody crosses them. Residents had been instructed not to buy fuel across the state line in Chihuahua, and in the weeks before the attack, the men manning the checkpoints on the smuggling routes near the community had been replaced by enforcers who were unfamiliar to residents and who occasionally pointed weapons at people using the road. A settlement like La Mora survives by being legible to the men running the roads around it. Those men know which trucks belong to the colony, which families use which routes, and which vehicles are moving children to school. That knowledge is the entire safety margin. When the men at the checkpoints are replaced, the margin disappears, and the people relying on it generally do not find out until something happens. Residents had noticed the new faces and had noticed weapons being pointed at them on a road they had driven their whole lives. What they had not done, because almost nobody in that situation does, was stop driving it. On the morning of November 4th, 2019, 3 women packed children into 3 SUVs and left La Mora heading in different directions. Ronita Maria Miller was 30 years old and driving toward the airport in Arizona to pick up her husband. Accounts differ on whether she was heading for Phoenix or Tucson. She had 4 of her children with her in a yellow Chevrolet Tahoe: 12-year-old Howard Jacob Miller Jr., 10-year-old Crystal Belaine Miller, and 8-month-old twins named Titus and Tiana. Her other 3 children stayed home. Donna Ray Langford was 43 and traveling toward Chihuahua for a family wedding with 9 of her children in her vehicle, among them 11-year-old Trevor and 2-year-old Rogan. Some accounts give Rogan's age as 2.5 and others as 3. Christina Marie Langford Johnson was traveling with them, with her 7-month-old daughter Faith. Her age is reported variously as 29 and 31. They were traveling in convoy for safety, which is what they already knew about the roads they were using. Somewhere along the route, Ronita's Tahoe got a flat tire. She fell behind while she dealt with it, and by the time the 2 groups reached the area where gunmen were waiting, there were roughly 10 miles between them. Ronita's vehicle was hit first, about 2 kilometers from the village of San Miguelito. When it was found, it had burned completely. 5 bodies were inside. All of them had been shot as well as burned. A family member who saw the scene said afterward that only ashes and a few bones remained of Ronita and her 4 children. Whether the vehicle was deliberately set alight or ignited during the attack has never been definitively established. 10 miles further along the road, the gunmen found the other 2 vehicles. Christina Langford Johnson put her baby daughter's car seat down on the floor of the SUV, out of the line of fire. Then she got out and stood in the open road with her hands raised, waving them, trying to signal that there were only women and children in the vehicles. Children who survived and later described it said she was shot twice, in the heart, while standing in the road with her arms in the air. Her body was found about 15 yards from the vehicle. Inside, surrounded by bullet holes, 7-month-old Faith was found alive and unhurt in the car seat where her mother had placed her. Donna Ray Langford and her children came under fire in the second white Suburban. Her 13-year-old son Devon later told ABC News that his mother began to pray as the shooters approached and tried to reach the steering wheel to drive out of it. She was shot and killed in front of him. His brothers Trevor and Rogan were also killed. Devon was uninjured. He got the surviving children out of the vehicle and into the scrub brush covering the mountainside, 5 of them bleeding from gunshot wounds, and covered them with branches to hide them in case anyone came back. Then he started walking. He walked 14 miles over rough ground and reached La Mora at around 5:30 in the afternoon, roughly 6 hours after the attack began. When Devon took too long to return, his 14-year-old sister Kylie, who had been shot in the foot, sent their 9-year-old sister Mackenzie to try again. Mackenzie left the hiding place alone, got lost, and walked about 10 miles over roughly 4 hours in the dark before search parties found her. The 5 children who stayed hidden in the brush were eventually reached by family members who drove out from La Mora after Devon arrived. A Mexican military helicopter transported 5 of the surviving children to hospitals in the United States. 9 people were killed, 3 mothers and 6 children, all of them United States citizens. It was the single largest loss of American civilian life to cartel violence in the history of the Mexican drug war, and it happened 70 miles from the Arizona border. The attribution settled on La Línea, the same organization identified in the killing of Benjamin Lebaron 10 years earlier. By 2019, the Juárez cartel had lost the war for Ciudad Juárez itself, and La Línea had been pushed out of the city into the rural west and northwest of Chihuahua, where it was fighting Sinaloa-aligned groups for control of the mountain corridors. Los Salazar, the organization La Mora had its accommodation with, was one of those Sinaloa-aligned groups. The road the convoy was traveling ran between the two, which is why gunmen were positioned along it at all. Mexican officials, including Security Minister Alfonso Durazo, offered the theory that the convoy had been mistaken for rival cartel vehicles, reasoning that the model of Suburban was commonly used by criminal groups in those mountains, and that gunmen, watching a contested route, drew a conclusion from 3 large American-style SUVs. The families rejected that explanation and have continued to reject it. Alex Lebaron, a member of the extended family and a state legislator in Chihuahua, went on the radio the day after and said it could not possibly have been a mistake. The investigation has never definitively established which version is correct. The 5 children with gunshot wounds were treated first in Douglas, Arizona, and several were transferred on to Tucson and Phoenix. Some of the injuries were serious enough to require multiple operations. The youngest of the wounded, Brixon, was 9 months old and had been shot in the chest and the wrist. The funerals began on November 7th. Donna Ray Langford and her sons Trevor and Rogan were buried together at La Mora in graves dug by hand, with around 500 mourners present and heavy military guard around the settlement. In late December 2019, federal authorities arrested Fidel Alejandro Villegas, the police chief of the Chihuahua town of Llanos, and flew him to Mexico City. Authorities said he had ties to organized crime. His precise role was never made clear publicly. In November 2020, Mexican authorities arrested Roberto González Montes, known as El 32 and El Mudo, at Juan Mata Ortiz in the municipality of Nuevo Casas Grandes, Chihuahua. The Federal Attorney General's office described him as a La Línea Plaza boss and as the intellectual author of the attack. He was a former state police officer. 2 other suspected members of the organization were detained with him. The operation was run by federal forces without involving state authorities, out of concern that he would be tipped off. On November 29, 2020, he was formally bound over for trial and held in preventive detention. Adrian Le Baron attended that hearing and was permitted to address him directly and asked him to help bring more people to justice so that Mexico could learn to live as a just country. By the time of that arrest, 17 people had been taken into custody in connection with the massacre. In January 2020, Mexican authorities had said they identified at least 40 suspects. In September 2023, Homeland Security Investigations and the United States Marshals Service arrested a 24-year-old man named Ivan Gustavo Hernandez Cabral in Albuquerque, New Mexico. He was convicted of illegal entry on September 8, 2023, and on October 13 he was removed and handed over to Mexican authorities at the Paso del Norte Bridge in El Paso. The case has often been described as an extradition, and it was not. It was an immigration removal. The status of these prosecutions inside Mexico, as of 2026, cannot be stated with confidence from the public record. Arrests were made, and charges were filed. There is no publicly confirmed conviction of the men identified as responsible for the deaths of 9 American citizens. Whether any part of the North Dakota judgment is ever collected is a separate question from whether it was entered. The cartel has no assets in the United States that a court can reach in any straightforward way, and the men named in it are in Mexico. Where accountability did land was in a courtroom in North Dakota. Howard Miller and Tyler Johnson, the widowers who worked in the oil fields there, brought a civil suit under the Anti-Terrorism Act. That statute allows American nationals injured by an act of international terrorism to sue for damages in United States federal court and to recover 3 times whatever the court awards. On June 24, 2022, Magistrate Judge Claire R. Hochhalter entered a default judgment because the cartel did not appear to contest the case. The base award of $1.5 billion was trebled under the statute to approximately $4.6 billion, with interest accruing at 6.5% annually. Whether any part of the North Dakota award is ever collected is a separate question from whether it was entered. The cartel holds no assets in the United States that a court can reach in any straightforward way, and the men named in the judgment are in Mexico. What the ruling created was a formal American legal finding that a Mexican criminal organization was liable for an act of terrorism against United States citizens. In January 2020, President Andrés Manuel López Obrador visited La Mora and announced that a monument would be built. It was later unveiled near the site of the attack in Bavispe, created by the sculptor Marlon Balderrama, incorporating images of the victims, a Mormon tree of life, and the angel Moroni. The 5 wounded children were treated first in Douglas, Arizona, and several were transferred on to Tucson and Phoenix. Some of the injuries required multiple operations. The youngest of the wounded was 9 months old and had been shot in the chest and the wrist. Around 150 residents, roughly 60% of La Mora, left after the massacre. Families that had been in that valley for generations packed up and crossed the border. Adrian Le Baron and Julian Le Baron became national figures in Mexico, pressing for accountability in a country where accountability of that kind is rare. 8 children survived the attack. 5 had gunshot wounds. Faith Johnson was 7 months old and was reunited with her father, Tyler Johnson, who had been in the United States when it happened and who would later be one of the 2 men who took the cartel to court in North Dakota. La Mora today holds a fraction of the people it held on November 3, 2019. The houses of the families who left are still standing, and the orchards and the grazing land are still there, in a valley that 4 generations spent building into something worth staying for. The White House response at the time included public discussion of designating Mexican cartels as terrorist organizations, a step that was not taken then and was taken in February 2025. That designation is what made the Camarena family's civil suit possible 6 years later, and it traces back to this road. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this one, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel more than you'd think. The following summer, over about 3 weeks, 3 foreign residents of the Baja California Peninsula died violently in 3 separate places, hundreds of miles apart. One was an American firefighter checking on a rental property. 2 were retirees who had been going down to the same stretch of coast for 35 years. No investigator has ever established a connection between any of them, and in 2 of the 3 cases, the person arrested had been standing nearby the whole time. Section 9. The Baja California Summer of 2020. Francisco Aguilar was a firefighter and paramedic with the Los Angeles Fire Department and had been with the department for 20 years. He was 48 years old and an Army veteran. 20 years is a substantial career in a department the size of the Los Angeles Fire Department, which runs more than 100 stations across a city of 4 million people and handles several 100,000 emergency responses a year. A paramedic with that much time has spent 2 decades arriving at scenes other people are running from. His family owned a condominium near Rosarito, about 13 miles south of Tijuana, which they rented out on Airbnb. On August 20th, 2020, he traveled to Rosarito alone to check on it. The trip was supposed to last a few days. Rosarito is a beach town that has been absorbing Southern Californians for generations. It is close enough to San Diego to be a weekend destination and cheap enough to be a place to own something outright. A significant number of Americans hold property there, some living in it full-time, and many, like the Aguilar family, using it as a rental. That rental economy is worth describing because it produces a specific pattern of travel. An owner living in Los Angeles goes down alone and on short notice to deal with a problem, tells people they will be back in a few days, and meets locals they have some working relationship with about repairs or cleaning or bookings. 20 years is a substantial career in a department the size of the Los Angeles Fire Department, which runs more than 100 stations across a city of 4 million people and handles several 100,000 emergency responses a year. When family members went to look for him, they found the condominium ransacked. His daughter Bella Aguilar described tables overturned and the place torn apart. 2 vehicles were missing. A laptop was missing. Aguilar was gone. The Los Angeles mayor at the time, Eric Garcetti, said publicly that Mexican authorities believed he had been the victim of a violent kidnapping. What Baja California's Central State Prosecutor, Hiram Sanchez Zamora, eventually laid out was smaller than a cartel kidnapping and in its way worse. According to prosecutors, a woman Aguilar knew, identified in Mexican practice only as Fanny N., 32 years old, and who had introduced herself to him as Montserrat, lured him to a meeting intending to kidnap him and hold him for ransom. When he arrived at the meeting place, a van intercepted him. Aguilar tried to run. A 27-year-old man, identified as Santos N., shot him. Prosecutors said it was not clear whether that shot killed him, but that he died during the crime, and that the couple then cremated his body in Playas de Rosarito. Neighbors near the address where the meeting was set had told authorities they heard gunfire that night. Blood recovered at the scene matched Aguilar's genetic profile. The couple were arrested in early October on a highway near Rosarito Beach with some of Aguilar's belongings, including credit cards in his name that had been used at businesses in Rosarito, Ensenada, and Tijuana after his disappearance. Both denied knowing him or ever having met him. Prosecutors said they would be charged with homicide. The credit cards issued in his name are what closed the gap between his disappearance and the arrests. Cards belonging to a person who has vanished continue generating a record every time they are used, with a location and a timestamp attached, and in this case, they were used repeatedly across 3 Baja cities over a period of weeks. That trail is available to investigators in a way that almost nothing else in a case like this is. His cremated skeletal remains were found on October 23, 2020, in an uninhabited area and identified through comparative genetic testing. Los Angeles Fire Chief Ralph Terrazas announced it publicly, saying it was a tragic outcome to a case the department had hoped would end differently. Between August 20 and October 23, there were 2 months in which his family did not know whether he was alive. His daughter gave interviews during that period. The department kept his status open. The FBI worked alongside Baja California investigators. For most of that time, the working assumption, stated publicly by the mayor of Los Angeles, was that he had been kidnapped and might still be recoverable. Mexican prosecutors did investigate whether organized crime played a role, including whether Aguilar's disappearance connected to a kidnapping of a farmer in the Rosarito area carried out by an organized crime group on September 4th. That line of inquiry was pursued and was never confirmed. On the record, this is a kidnapping for ransom by 2 people that ended in a shooting and a cremation. San Quintin, the town nearest the second case, is an agricultural center rather than a resort. The valley around it produces strawberries, tomatoes, and other export crops on a large scale, worked by a migrant labor force drawn largely from southern Mexico. The foreign residents scattered along that coastline live among that economy rather than apart from it, in small settlements reached by dirt roads off the highway. Ian Hirschson was 78 years old and lived in Solana Beach in San Diego County. He was born in South Africa, graduated from Princeton, and worked as an aerospace engineer before retiring. He was a widower. Since 1985, he had kept a house at El Socorrito, a tiny beach settlement south of San Quintin, about 130 miles below Ensenada. He owned the house. He did not own the land, and the land belonged to a local ranching family he had known for 35 years. Kathy Harvey was 73, from the Tierra Santa neighborhood of San Diego, originally from New York, and a retired physical therapist who had worked for 3 decades and finished in 2014. She was a breast cancer survivor. She and Hirschson were not married. They were close friends who traveled together and explored Baja together, and her son described her as someone with a long list of places she still wanted to see. El Socorrito barely qualifies as a settlement. It amounts to a handful of structures on a stretch of coast well south of San Quintin, reached by dirt road, with no police presence, no hospital, and no reliable communications. The neighbors are ranch families who have worked that land for generations. The Americans who keep places there do so because it is empty and beautiful, and almost nobody goes there. Hirschson had been driving down every couple of months for 35 years. His neighbor in Solana Beach described him as a gentleman who never had an unkind word about anybody. They went down in late August 2020 for about a week. On the night of August 28th, Harvey texted her son Robert to say they were planning either to look at a gold mine or spend the day at the beach. They were due back in San Diego 3 days later. They did not come back. Families reported them missing on September 2nd. Reporting an American missing in rural Mexico sets in motion a process with more gaps in it than most families expect. The relatives contact the nearest American consulate, which can pass information to Mexican authorities and can request welfare checks, but has no investigative authority and cannot search. Mexican searches are run by the state prosecutor's office of whichever state the person vanished in. In a case like this, the family in San Diego was several hundred miles from a house that had no phone service, in a state whose investigators had to travel most of a day to reach it, with no way of establishing whether the 2 people were injured, stranded, or dead. Their dark blue Toyota Land Cruiser was found abandoned in a remote area near Ensenada, roughly 3 hours north of the house. On September 5, their bodies were recovered from a well about 60 feet deep, roughly 4 miles from the house. A witness led investigators to it. San Diego police confirmed the identifications on September 7. Prosecutors described a burglary. They believed the killer entered the house intending to rob it and stabbed both of them while they were in bed. He then put the bodies into Hirschson's own Land Cruiser, drove about 4 miles, and dropped them into the well. The recovery took time and equipment the area did not have. A well of that depth in remote terrain requires rope, lighting, and personnel trained to work at the bottom of a shaft, all of which had to be brought in from elsewhere, and the operation ran across days. On January 26, 2021, the Baja California Attorney General's office announced an arrest. The suspect was identified only as Emmanuel N. Hirschson's daughter, Ava Setzer, identified him as a member of the family that owned the ranch where her father's house sat, and said her father had known that family well for decades, including the man now accused of killing him. Prosecutors described the suspect as a drug user and a would-be burglar. Robert Harvey said afterward that he took comfort in knowing there would be consequences. Setzer, asked how she was processing it, said she could not describe how difficult the months had been. The land arrangement at El Socorrito is part of the background to that arrest and is common across rural Baja. A foreign national cannot hold coastal land directly, so an American who wants a house on that coast builds it on ground belonging to a Mexican family and holds the structure while the family holds the land. It works for decades on the strength of a relationship, and it means the foreigner and the landowning family are permanently entangled. Hirschson had been in that arrangement since 1985. He had watched the children of that family grow up, and by prosecutors' account, one of them entered the house he had built on their land, intending to rob it, and killed both people asleep inside. The third case in that summer requires a correction attached to it. On the evening of September 5, 2020, the body of a 65-year-old man named Craig Harrison washed ashore at Cabo Pulmo at the southern end of the peninsula in Baja California Sur. He had been missing since August 29th. An autopsy determined he had been stabbed in the chest before entering the water. A backpack filled with rocks had been attached to his back. His car was missing. Authorities offered no motive, and no suspect was ever identified. Craig Harrison was not American. He was a dual South African and Canadian citizen. He ran a wine import business in Canada, invested in Los Cabos property in the 1980s, and moved to Baja permanently in 1997. He and his wife Lori built real estate and vacation rental businesses there. He appears in this section as context and is not one of the 10, and any account describing a third American death in Baja that summer has the citizenship wrong. Cabo Pulmo, where Harrison was found, sits at the southern tip of the peninsula and is best known for a marine park protecting one of the few living coral reefs in the Sea of Cortez. It is a small settlement of a few hundred people with a heavy foreign presence, built around diving and vacation rentals, and it is roughly 900 miles by road from Rosarito, where Frank Aguilar disappeared. His case is also disputed in a way the others are not. A friend told the Toronto Sun that the official account appeared to shift over time from murder towards suicide. The physical evidence, a stab wound to the chest and a backpack of rocks, argues against that. Some accounts date the discovery to September 12 rather than September 5. Nothing about it was ever resolved. No Mexican or American authority has publicly linked these three cases to each other, and there is no reason from the available evidence to think they are linked. 3 foreigners who had made lives on the same peninsula died violently within about 3 weeks in 3 places separated by hundreds of miles, for what appear to be 3 separate reasons. Baja California has consistently recorded more homicides of foreign nationals than any other Mexican state, which is partly a function of having more foreign nationals in it, and partly a function of Tijuana. It has no mechanism that treats a dead American differently from a dead Mexican, which means an American killed in a Baja village enters the same state caseload as everyone else, several hundred miles from the prosecutor's office responsible for it. Ensenada Municipality, where 2 of the 3 cases fall, is the largest in Mexico by land area, running from the Pacific across to the Sea of Cortez and hundreds of miles down the peninsula. One prosecutorial office is responsible for all of it. Vicente Calderon, the editor of Tijuana Press, observed at the time that the area around San Quintin is rural and full of expatriate communities, close to the coastline. The Baja Peninsula has thousands of foreign residents living in small settlements, often isolated, often on land they cannot legally own, often in houses that stand empty for months, often known to everyone around them as people with more than their neighbors have. Most of them will live there for decades without incident. Aguilar was lured to a meeting by someone he knew. Hirschson and Harvey were killed, according to prosecutors, by a young man from the family whose land the house sat on, a family Hirschson had known for 35 years. Neither case involved a stranger, and neither involved a highway. Both involved the ordinary social fabric of the places these people had chosen to live. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this one, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel more than you'd think. The final case is the most recent and the one where the least is known. An American couple who kept a house in a small town in Michoacan arrived for the holidays in 2024. 11 days later, they were shot in a vehicle a short distance from that house. No motive has ever been given, no suspect has been named, and the only thread anybody has found runs through the family they were staying with. Section 10. Rafael Cardona Aguilera and Gloria Ambris de Cardona. Rafael Cardona Aguilera was born in the United States and was 53 years old. Gloria Ambris de Cardona was 50 and had been born in Mexico and naturalized as an American citizen. They lived in the Sacramento area of Northern California and owned a home in Angamacutiro, a small municipality in the north of the Mexican state of Michoacan, about 230 miles west of Mexico City, which is thus 2024, to spend the holidays. That arrangement describes an enormous number of families along the western United States. A generation emigrates, builds a life in California or Texas or Illinois, and keeps a house in the town they or their parents came from. They go back for Christmas, for weddings, for funerals. The house sits empty most of the year and is looked after by relatives. It is one of the most ordinary arrangements in North America, and it places American citizens into small Mexican towns for a few weeks at a time every year, in places that appear on no tourist map and that have no consular presence within several hours' drive. Michoacan is one of the more dangerous states in Mexico to do that in, and the reasons go back 4 decades. Cartels moved into it during the 1980s. Its homicide rate has run at more than twice the national average. It is the origin point of La Familia Michoacana and later the Knights Templar, and it has been contested for years between the Jalisco New Generation Cartel and a shifting collection of local organizations. La Familia Michoacana announced itself in September 2006 by throwing 5 severed heads onto the floor of a nightclub in Uruapan, along with a note claiming the group killed only those who deserved it. It presented itself as a protective force for the state and combined that presentation with methamphetamine production on an industrial scale. After its leadership was broken up, the remnant reorganized under the name the Knights Templar, which adopted a quasi-religious code, issued its own rulebook to members, and moved steadily out of drug production and into taxing the legal economy instead. That shift is what produced the situation the state is in now. By 2013, the extortion had become heavy enough that farmers and business owners in several Michoacan municipalities armed themselves and formed self-defense groups, driving cartel operatives out of towns the state had failed to protect. The federal government eventually moved to absorb those groups into official structures. What followed was a period in which the boundary between a self-defense force, a municipal police unit, and a criminal organization became difficult to establish from outside, and in several municipalities, the same men occupied more than one of those categories over time. The economics of the violence there are agricultural as much as they are about drugs. Nearly 3/4 of Mexican avocados come from Michoacán, and the state also supplies a large share of the limes consumed in the United States. Both industries have been systematically extorted for over a decade. Growers pay per hectare or per truck. Packing plants pay to operate. Transport companies pay to move product to the border. Cartels have in some cases forced landowners off orchards outright and taken over production. Alongside that, there is illegal logging, which clears land for new orchards and sells the timber, and fuel theft from the pipelines crossing the state. The United States State Department has for years advised Americans not to travel to Michoacán at all. That advisory sits at level 4, the highest of 4 grades, and the same one applied to active war zones, and it covers the entire state with limited carve-outs. Travel advisories of that kind carry no legal force. An American citizen can enter Michoacán freely, and hundreds of thousands do every year, because a very large share of the Mexican-American population of California, Illinois, and Texas has family roots in exactly that state. The advisory also has no practical bearing on people in the Cardenas' position. A level 4 warning is written for travelers deciding whether to book a trip. It is not written for a family deciding whether to spend Christmas in the town their relatives live in a house they already own. The extortion operates on a schedule rather than as a series of incidents. Amounts are set, collection is routine, and refusal carries consequences that everyone in the industry understands without needing them stated. American and Canadian buyers have periodically suspended purchasing from parts of the state after threats against inspectors, which is the only mechanism that has ever produced a rapid federal response, because it interrupts an export flow worth billions of dollars a year. There is one further piece of local context in this case, and it is the only real thread anybody has found. Angamacutiro sits in the Bajío, an agricultural belt of small towns in northern Michoacán that runs up against the Guanajuato state line. It is not part of the avocado country in the south of the state, and it is not on any tourist route. It is farm country that has been sending people north for 4 generations, and it empties and refills with the migration calendar. December is the month it refills, when families who live in California and Illinois come back for the holidays, and the population of a town like that visibly changes for 3 or 4 weeks. The Cardenas arrived inside that annual movement along with everyone else. Rafael Cardona was the brother of Lucia Cardona Aguilera, who heads the local family services office in Angamacutiro and who is married to the town's mayor, Hermes Arnulfo Pacheco Bribiesca. That made Rafael the mayor's brother-in-law. According to reporting on the case, the couple was staying at the mayor's residence during their visit. According to a United States official relaying information to CNN, Pacheco had taken office after his predecessor was kidnapped and murdered in late October 2024. The documented Mexican record does not quite match that. The previous mayor of Angamacutiro, Maribel Juarez Blanquet, disappeared on June 15, 2024, and her whereabouts have never been established. She appears on published lists of Michoacán political figures who vanished or were killed during that period, and her case remains an unresolved disappearance rather than a closed murder. Families who own property in a town like that and live abroad occupy an awkward position inside that system. A house that stands empty most of the year and fills up every December belongs to people who are visibly better off than their neighbors and who are present for only a few weeks at a time. They are not there long enough to be part of any local arrangement, and they are conspicuous enough to be noticed arriving. Michoacán has become one of the most dangerous places in the world to hold local office. Mayors, candidates, council members, and municipal police chiefs are killed there with a regularity that has stopped generating national coverage. In November 2025, the mayor of Uruapan, one of Michoacán's largest cities, was assassinated in public during a festival while surrounded by his own security detail. The reason is not obscure. Municipal government in that state controls contracts, police, permits, and the flow of money through the avocado and lime economies, and criminal organizations have concluded that controlling municipal government is more efficient than fighting it. Families who own land in that countryside and live abroad occupy an awkward position inside that system, because a house that stands empty most of the year and fills up every December belongs to people who are visibly better off than their neighbors and who are present for only a few weeks at a time. The Bajío has its own security problems separate from the avocado belt further south. The corridor running through northern Michoacán into Guanajuato has been contested for years between the Jalisco New Generation Cartel and the Santa Rosa de Lima group, a conflict built around fuel theft from the pipelines crossing that terrain rather than around drug routes. Guanajuato has recorded some of the highest homicide totals of any Mexican state as a result, and the municipalities on the Michoacán side of that line sit inside the same dispute. On the night of Wednesday, December 11, 2024, at around 10 minutes to midnight, Rafael and Gloria were shot. The Michoacán Attorney General's office reported that responders were alerted to gunfire directed at the occupants of a pickup in Angamacutiro. Gloria was pronounced dead at the scene. Rafael was wounded and died a short time later while being treated at a hospital in the nearby town of Puruándiro. The attack happened close to their home. There is a conflict in the record about what they were driving, and it is not a small detail because it goes to whether they were the intended targets. CNN, citing a United States official who was relaying a statement Rafael's brother Cesar gave to local police, reported that the couple were driving the mayor's truck. Mexican outlets including EFE and Telemundo, citing the Michoacán Attorney General's office, reported that they were found in a 2016 Ford Platinum pickup. One Mexican account added that the truck carried license plates from the state of Querétaro. Those versions cannot all be right, and no available source resolves it. Their bodies were released to the family after the forensic process concluded. Rafael was 53 and Gloria was 50. They had been in the country for 11 days. Puruándiro, where Rafael died, is the nearest town with a hospital capable of treating gunshot wounds, roughly 20 minutes away by road. Angamacutiro itself has a small health center rather than a hospital, which is standard for a municipality that size, and which meant that a wounded man had to be moved before anything could be done for him. Growers in the avocado and lime belts pay per hectare or per truck. Packing plants pay to operate, and transport companies pay to move product toward the border. That structure has been documented for over a decade and has survived every federal operation directed at it. Investigators recovered ballistic evidence at the scene. The State Attorney General's office, through spokeswoman Magdalena Guzman, said a team of prosecutors, ministerial police, and forensic experts had been assigned and that several lines of investigation were open, while stating plainly that the motive had not been identified. Angamacutiro is a municipality of a few tens of thousands of people in the Bajío region, an agricultural belt of small towns that has sent people north for 4 generations and that empties and refills with the migration calendar. December is the month it refills. Families who live in California and Illinois come back for the holidays, and the population of a town like that visibly changes for 3 or 4 weeks. The Cardonas arrived inside that annual movement along with everyone else. The town cancelled every event scheduled for December, which had been due to run from the 10th through the 23rd, and held a memorial mass on Saturday, December 14th, at the Parroquia de San Francisco. The bodies were released to the family and buried in Angamacutiro. The town's own government confirmed the relationship publicly within a day, naming Rafael as the brother of the head of the Municipal Family Services Office and the brother-in-law of the mayor. That confirmation is why the case was reported at all outside Michoacán. The United States State Department confirmed the deaths of 2 American citizens and said it was closely monitoring the local investigation. No motive has been established. No suspect has been publicly named. No arrest has been announced. Whether the couple were the intended targets or were hit in an attack aimed at the mayor's household is the question the whole case turns on, and the answer depends on which vehicle they were in, which is the one fact the available accounts disagree about. Mexico's impunity rate for homicide has been measured for years at above 90%, meaning the overwhelming majority of murders in the country never result in a conviction of anyone. That figure reflects a system in which state prosecutors are underfunded, frequently compromised, and operating in territory where investigating certain crimes carries a personal cost. The difficulty of the individual cases has very little to do with it. A double homicide of 2 American citizens in a small Michoacan town, with no witnesses who will speak and no political constituency pressing for answers, is the kind of case that generates a file and then nothing. A Michoacan state homicide file of this kind is worked by the regional prosecutor's office, with whatever ministerial police and forensic staff are available in that district. Angamacutiro is not near the state capital. The nearest regional office covers a set of municipalities across the northern Bajío, and it handles every category of serious crime occurring in all of them. The federal government in Mexico City has jurisdiction over certain categories of crime, including organized crime offenses, and can pull a case up from the state level when it chooses to. That did not happen here. No public statement from the Federal Attorney General's office has connected the killings to any organized crime investigation, which leaves the file where it started. The State Department can confirm deaths. It cannot investigate them. American citizenship does not transfer a homicide case to American jurisdiction, and unless a federal statute reaches the conduct, as it did in the Walker, Camarena, and Zapata cases, the investigation belongs entirely to the Mexican state where it happened. For Rafael Cardona and Gloria Ambriz, that is Michoacan, the violence around that household did not stop. In May 2026, armed men in at least 2 vehicles opened fire on the facade of a house in Angamacutiro, linked to Mayor Pacheco. The house was empty at the time. The Michoacan State Prosecutor's Office opened an investigation, and the gunmen were believed to have fled toward neighboring Guanajuato. State authorities have identified cells connected to the Jalisco New Generation Cartel operating in that part of the Michoacan Bajío. Their names appeared in American news coverage for about a week in December 2024. The town cancelled Christmas. Their family buried them in the place they had kept a house so they could come home to it. If you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure to subscribe. I'll see you in the next one.